This is the Hagman and Hagman Report for today. It's Wednesday, February 18th, 2015. I'm Doug Hagman, flying solo tonight. Usually, here is my son, usually. However, he's recovering from surgery. He's recovering at home, by the way. He's doing well, a little sore, a little rough around the edges, but otherwise, it made it through just fine, and he should be back tomorrow. If not, we can always bring the studio to him, perhaps, or tape him to a gurney and bring him out here. But thanks for your concern and your emails of support. Folks, you're listening to the only show where the news is presented to you in 3D. We look well beyond the headlines and bylines and bring you the news behind the news. And I think tonight you're going to see just that. You're going to get a taste of this. It's going to be absolutely incredible what you're going to hear tonight. For new listeners, I just want to make sure everyone knows, for new listeners, we broadcast live each and every weeknight from 8 to 11 p.m. Eastern. Our home base on the internet is hagmanandhagman.com, and we're also simulcast by the Christians United Broadcasting Network. There you can tune us in at the hagmanandhagmanreport.com. Spell it all out, folks, and you can hook right into us there. I want to remind everyone this show, tonight's broadcast, is sponsored in part by NatureBox. NatureBox ships great tasting, wholesome snacks right to your door. You can forget about the vending machine, the snack aisles. Start snacking much smarter with wholesome, delicious treats. I could name them off, but it would take too long. You can support this show by ordering a free NatureBox sampler box at naturebox.com/CFP radio. That's right. Free NatureBox snacks are found at naturebox.com/CFP radio. Having said that, I've got to welcome two very special guests tonight, Mr. Steve Quayle, stevequayle.com, and Mr. Timothy Alberino of the Alberino Analysis via stevequayle.com and Genesis 6 Giants. I want to thank everyone for joining us. Thank you so much for your belief and trust in us. With this, with everything, we're going to be talking about stargates, pyramids, and portals, and Atlantis. Steve, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Doug, and it'll be a delight tonight to be on with Tim Alberino and you and Joe and share some of the most amazing revelations I think that God has preserved for this time. When you wrote the introduction you wrote to tonight's show on your website, hagmanandhagman.com, I was blown away because I think it's important, and I know it's important, that there are specific things that God reserves for specific times to reveal. And as we go to the radio tonight, and for the record, it's February 18th, 2015, the slaughter of our brethren worldwide is absolutely a rehash of what the devil has always sought to do: wipe the very image and creation of the living God off the world stage. So when you hear when you hear of what's going on to the brethren across the world and 21 Christians being beheaded and a sea of blood, these are all biblical not only references but images coming to mind. So, you quoted today, George Orwell said it best: "He who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past." And what Tim Alberino and I are going to be talking about tonight is to put things into perspective. Unless you understand the book of Genesis, and there are a lot of people who say, I don't want to even bother myself with it, you cannot understand the basis of the war that's raging in the heavens, that's soon to be manifest in every one of your lives, my life, our lives, my children's lives, and my grandkids' lives. So tonight we're going to talk about just the battle that is on and why stargates, pyramids, giants, and Atlantis, and the suppression of history is so important. Now, Tim will get in the later part of the show, and I'm going to take about 5 minutes and read something, and I'm going to turn it directly over to Tim. Most people don't get the significance of giants. Most people don't understand that there's a very group of insidious, Luciferian, and fallen angels trying to control the history of the past so that they can insert at the time and place of their choosing a whole, if you will, artificial or synthetic paradigm into the battle between good and evil. There's a mouthful. Now, I'm reading from Phineas T. Dakes. It's on my website, stevequayle.com. I'm sorry, it's on Genesis6Giants.com, Genesis6Giants.com. And the question is, why giants? You get emails like that. I know Tim's got them. I get them all the time. So why is this so important? Well, it's really important, and I'm going to read this and quote. This is Phineas Dake. By the grace of God, I will always give attribution when I know it, because, again, the Scripture is very clear on people who steal each man's words from another. If God isn't powerful enough to give preachers original text, then the preacher, I would say, doesn't understand his calling. They can argue with me, they can do whatever they want, but the bottom line is, as I've quoted Campbell McAlpine before, he said, if it doesn't burn in your heart, don't preach it. And if it doesn't burn in your heart, you better check out your heart. Why Giants by Phineas Dakes. And we give it over to Tim. We'll talk about his amazing accelerated expedition to Sardinia and why it's critical, and how getting ready for South America and the expedition is going to take place there in the coming weeks, how this all ties together. And again, this couldn't, Doug, Joe, and Tim, have happened 5 years ago. It couldn't have happened 10 years ago, because quite candidly, it wasn't time. But the time of the revealing is upon us. It was the purpose of Satan and his fallen angels to corrupt the human race and thereby do away with pure Adamic stock, through whom the seed of the woman should come. This would avert their own doom and make it possible for Satan and his kingdom to keep control of the planet Earth indefinitely. It was said to Adam and Eve that the seed of the woman should defeat Satan and restore man's dominion. Genesis 3:15, and I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. The only way then for Satan to avoid this predicted defeat was to corrupt the pure Adamite or Adamic line, so that the coming of the seed of woman in the world would be made impossible. This he tried to accomplish by sending some of his fallen angels to marry the daughters of men, as in Genesis 6:1-4. I call Genesis 6, for the record, the absolute Rosetta Stone to understanding all of history, and to understanding all conspiracies, and to understanding all spiritual warfare. Back to what Phineas Dakes wrote. Genesis 6:1-4. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives, all of which they chose. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he is also flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became the mighty men which are of old, men of renown, and producing the giant nations through them. Now this is critical, because some people want to argue that this is a Sethite versus a Canaanite. Wrong. There were giants in those days before the flood and after the flood. Interestingly enough, Doug, and we talked about this once, but it came as a revelation to me instantly about, maybe 3 months ago, that, and I've never thought this before, being a researcher, written up, literally years and years of study, but the only two places the word Nephilim is used is in Genesis 6 and Numbers 13:33. After that, the word Rephaim, or the giants, are used exclusively. There are two such eruptions of fallen angels taught in Genesis 6:4. There were giants in the earth in those days before the flood, and also after that, after the flood, when the sons of God, the fallen angels, came into the daughters of men, and any daughters of men, whether they were Cain's daughters, Seth, and others, and they bare children to them, and which is meaning the angels. Satan almost succeeded in his plan during the first eruption, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth, and all the multitude, and Noah and his sons were the only pure Adamic stock left to be preserved by the ark. Now, they weren't morally perfect, obviously, but they certainly were genetically perfect. And that should astound people. If they go back and look at the populations projected in those days, 8 out of, if it was 10 million, 15 million, 100 million, whatever it was, that's very few. And it leads to the immediate statement that the remnant is very, very small. 1 Peter 3:19-20, by which also he went, Jesus, preached unto the spirits in prison, which sometime were disobedient, when the once the long-suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being built or being prepared, wherein few, that is, 8 souls, were saved by water. The main objective of the flood was to do away with all satanic corruption, destroy the giants, and preserve the pure Adamic stock, so as to make good the guarantee of the coming of the seed of woman, as in the plan of God. now everyone, how do I say this, fast forward into the times that we're talking about. And we're talking about the end of humanity as God created us through artificial intelligence, through cyborgs, through transhumanism, through singularity. All those things I've written about extensively in Xenogenesis. Tom Horn and I have done hours on Hagman and Hagman trying to address these issues. Even Elon Musk is worried about the if you will, the termination machines that are already in place. So behind all this, ladies and gentlemen, is a very real devil, very real fallen angels. And so when we get right now to Tim's expedition and how this came about in such an accelerated way, because we weren't planning to go, and I did not go. Tim, another brother, and we won't give out their names, but two other people accompanied Tim to Sardinia, where Tim basically interviewed some of the oldest, well-informed people, and it's going to be amazing to hear the story. So, Tim, I want you to share now, if you would. We're talking about giants. We're talking about the universal presence of giants. We're talking about the universal, if you will, presentation of pyramids all over the world, yet the great cover-up continues until that time that the evil and the evil ones and all their minions and all their controllers decide to spin it for their benefit. And we get into maybe an hour or so away, we'll be talking about the 10 kings that no one wants to deal with in the book of Revelation. And I think you'll be pretty astounded, Doug, Joe, and everyone listening, that there are other alternatives for just the standard dispensationalism, which, for the record, I have rejected for 20-some years. But the point is that, Tim, share about the fascinating undertaking, how it came to, take place in Sardinia, and what basically the amazing doors and testimonies that were opened up to you and the team.
Okay. A week ago today, actually, I just got back from Sardinia, got back on the 11th. And about 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago, somewhere in that area, I received a phone call from an individual who told me about a certain situation in Sardinia, Italy, concerning evidence of giants, and specifically concerning possible fragments, bones, and implements that belong to a race of giants. So obviously, Steve and I were very interested in this, and we decided that this is something we need to go and take a look at right away, because we were also told that the government was, that it was a very oppressive situation over in Sardinia, something that many people don't know about, that the government of Sardinia, specifically the archaeological institutions in Sardinia, are oppressing certain individuals who I won't name on this broadcast, are oppressing certain individuals in Sardinia because they have been investigating and turning up evidence of giants on the island. Now, before I begin to talk about this, for those who don't know where Sardinia is located, Sardinia is a large island off the western coast of Rome. It's kind of above Sicily. It's off the western coast of Rome. There's the little island of Corsica above Sardinia. Corsica belongs to the French. Sardinia belongs to Italy. So Sardinia is Italy. It's a part of Italy. but like Sicily, it kind of has its own cultural background, but it is part of Italy. So anyway, Steve and I thought, after looking at what we were told and after doing a little bit of research on Sardinia ourselves, we decided this is something that we need to do immediately while there's still something to be seen, before all of the evidence completely disappears, or before the oppression gets so bad that people won't be willing to talk anymore. So within 2 weeks of getting this phone call, I was on an airplane with two other individuals heading for Sardinia, basically heading for Rome, and then from Rome to Sardinia. And I didn't know what to expect, except that we were looking for evidence of giants, something to do with artifacts concerning giants. And once we went into the interior of Sardinia and met the contact who we were going to talk to and who was going to be taking us around Sardinia, showing us certain archaeological sites, I quickly became convinced that this was something monumental in terms of discoveries relating to giants. We interviewed this gentleman in Sardinia, and he told us some astounding stories, which, quite frankly, some of them were so astounding that it was hard for us to believe. We were quite skeptical to begin with. The first day of our time with this individual was spent just interviewing him, and after we interviewed him and also interviewed a few other individuals, and I'll get into some of the things that they said in a minute. Again, we were pretty skeptical, but after the interviews, the next day we went and began to see for ourselves the evidence that is still standing in Sardinia. And this individual grew up in Sardinia. He grew up in the same village all of his life, and he's very familiar with all of Sardinia, especially the immediate area around the village in which he lives. Again, I'm not going to name this individual yet because we have an ongoing investigation, and there's some other things that we're doing. So we're going to have to be vague tonight, but we have a film coming out that's going to show all the details and lots of footage of the interviews and everything. But tonight we're going to be a little bit vague. But this individual, where he lived and grew up, where he was born in Sardinia, happens to be an area that is literally just absolutely ensconced in megalithic ruins. And what was more impressive to me, and what I immediately was able to recognize, were mounds. And when I say mounds, I'm talking about mounds like unto the mounds that were discovered in the United States a couple hundred years ago, when the whole of this country was at one time dotted with these mounds, artificial mounds that were constructed by a race of giants. And for anybody who's familiar with the history of the Smithsonian and has read Steve's books, will be familiar with the Smithsonian cover-up of the red-haired race of giants, not just red-haired, but prominently red-haired race of giants that once existed in the United States, that once lived in the United States. And so immediately, by the way, most of those mounds have been taken apart, and obviously whatever remains of giant skeletons were to be found inside of them, because basically they were tombs, have since been removed by the Smithsonian. And of course, nobody really knows where they've gone. They've taken the bones and either destroyed them, or they're in some dusty room in the back of the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., or wherever. But Sardinia, particularly around the village of this individual who we were interviewing, is absolutely dotted with these mounds. They're everywhere. And we're talking about the artificial mounds. And it's hard for me to describe the mounds over the radio, but we have plenty of footage of these mounds that we're going to be putting in our documentary film. And it is very apparent that these are, in fact, artificial mounds. And on top of many of these mounds, in fact, on top of all of them, there are ruins, megalithic ruins, the remains of megalithic ruins. So that's the first thing that we noticed right off the bat. And obviously we had an interpreter with us, and so this individual didn't speak English, so everything was through an Italian interpreter. And we began to see that we are dealing with a situation that is reminiscent of the America in the mid and late 19th century, when all of these giant bones were being dug up. Except the difference in Sardinia is that they're still there for the most part. The giant bones are still there, and the mounds are still there, and the ruins are still there, and the stories are still there. So basically, again, we realized really quickly, hey, we're kind of like in the United States in the late 19th century or the mid-19th century, when all this stuff was starting to literally pop out, was being dug up from these burial sites. And so we started to get really excited because, again, the first day we had heard a lot of testimony. We were kind of skeptical because a lot of it was really sensational. But now we're starting to actually get out and start to see stuff out there. And the excitement is beginning to grow because, hey, we've got mounds, and we started to go up and visit some of these sites and go up on top of some of these mounds, and without a doubt, we were dealing with megalithic structures that are very similar to the different megalithic sites around the world, the different ancient megalithic sites around the world. But paradoxically, I had never heard of all of these megalithic ruins existing in Sardinia. I've done a lot of research, and I never came across the fact that Sardinia was still full of these artificial mounds and megalithic ruins. So something that we noticed immediately was that every site that had megalithic ruins also had trees planted in rows in front of it. And we were told quite matter-of-factly that the municipalities planted the trees, were ordered to plant the trees in front of these sites in order to conceal the fact that they existed, that they were there. And so that's one of the first things that we noticed was we'd look down over the ridge and there was we'd look down the hill and there was a town, and from the town you could see the megalithic sites. And so from that view, from that perspective, trees were carefully planted in rows to cover up what was on top of the mound, what was on top of the particular site that we were on. And so it became apparent very quickly that we were dealing with a cover-up, and not a very good one, because in a nutshell, what's happening in Sardinia and what's happened in Sardinia, both according to the testimony that we were able to get on camera, and also according to our own eyewitness account, we went and we saw that this is in fact the case, is that for years now there's been an effort to get rid of anything that doesn't fit into the archaeological norms of the historical orthodoxy. So, in other words, in Sardinia, the historians, I should say the archaeologists, are willing and eager to show everybody ruins that belong to the Romans or the Carthaginians, or the culture that they call the Nuraghi culture, but they absolutely deny the existence, pretend that the ruins that belong to a more ancient culture with more sophisticated technology, they pretend that they're not even there. They literally pretend that there's nothing to see there. And again, in fact, trees are planted in front of all of these sites. And on any kind of site that you see in Sardinia that looks like a pyramid, which we'll get to in a minute, any site that looks like geometric symmetry, anything that looks like it might have been a building of some kind that is not identified in the archaeological orthodoxy as a touristic site, is covered with trees so that it obscures its shape and blocks some of the megalithic ruins that are still there. They've removed, and when I say they, I'm talking about two organizations, one specifically, which is at the heart of everything, which is the Vatican, and then the municipalities of Sardinia that are basically taking orders from the Vatican to remove everything, especially anything that has to do with the bones of giants. And I've never been, in my entire life, I've never been in a place, and for the listeners, I lived in Peru for 10 years, and Peru still has a lot of crazy archaeological stuff, but I've never been in a place where I felt like I was literally standing on top of giant bones. That's what I felt like everywhere I went in Sardinia. It felt like if we were to dig down into this mound, we would discover giant bones. And now, right off the bat, let me tell everybody why we didn't dig anywhere in Sardinia. The reason why we didn't dig anywhere in Sardinia is because it is explicitly banned to look for giant bones. And I asked this is coming from one of our contacts there, and I asked him, so there's a specific law against actually looking for giant bones, giant artifacts? He said, absolutely. In other words, you can't go digging down into mounds looking for anything because they know you're going to probably discover, in certain areas, you're certainly going to discover giant bones, remains of gigantic humanoid entities. We were standing actually in one particular on the first place that we went to, the first place that we visited, not far from our contact's home. You can see his village down the hill. We were shown the area where our contact first discovered a giant skeleton when he was a child. And his story goes that when he was a child, he used to play in this area that used to have a lot of megalithic ruins still standing. In other words, standing structures were there. And he describes all these structures to detail, and we got it all on camera, and it's going to be in the film. That when he was a child, he used to play. When he was, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, he used to play up there with his friends. And, the village was only a mile away, so they used to run up there and play around the ruins, the megalithic ruins. And they used to play inside of the different caves and the different tombs and the different structures that were still open at that time, which would have been some 50-odd years ago. And he described for us with great detail the first time he came upon a giant skeleton as we stood over the grave of that giant. And the grave was a very large grave. And again, we have it on film. Very large grave. And you could obviously see that there was some sort of a structure, some sort of a megalithic ceiling, and that the grave was definitely constructed, or at least seemed to be constructed for somebody a lot taller than an average man. And he told us that the giant skeleton that he used to play with his friend that was in that tomb was, if I remember right, if memory serves me right, it was somewhere around 12 feet, maybe up to 15 feet. And that, of course, is the estimation of a child, but nonetheless, he has many recollections of when he was a young adult, also coming upon these bones, and so it wasn't a one-time occurrence for him. So they used to actually play with this particular skeleton in this particular tomb where we were standing. We were standing on it, and it had obviously been filled in with dirt. I mean, the whole thing had just been filled in with dirt. It's a very sloppy cover-up. Let me say that to begin with here. And so it was filled in with dirt, and we were standing on top of it, and he was describing this situation, how he and his friend one day were out there, and it was storming, and it started to rain really hard, and so they went into the tomb to get out of the rain, and they discovered this giant skeleton, and this was the very first one he discovered when he was a child. I forget how old he was. I think he was somewhere around 10 years old. And the giant was, he described for us the size and scope of the skeleton, and he said that they used to play with the giant's, basically the giant sinews in its arm, because it was mummified, and there was still basically meat on the giant's bones, and they would tug at the sinews in the arm, or some of the muscles in the arm connected to the hand, and they would play with it and make the fingers move by tugging on it. And he went into this great detail, and he described how massive the hand was, and obviously he was describing a giant. And so we were at that site. We filmed that site. We got his testimony at that site, and it was really amazing because obviously I'm standing there on this tomb that's been filled in with dirt, looking down towards the village that he grew up in, which was about a mile away, and the hill that we were on leading up to the tombs, where the giant's tombs were, was covered with trees planted in rows, as if the villagers were idiots and they weren't going to remember that those tombs were once there. I mean, those trees were literally planted there to block the view from the village. And we've got that on film. And so it was a. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I want everybody to know that Doug, the picture that you put up, I'm going to send you right now, if you want to put it up on your website, Pyramids in China. And this is critical because the Chinese government did the same thing that the Sardinian government did, is they think that by planting trees up the face of a filled-in step pyramid, or basically just covering up with enough dirt and planting enough trees, that somehow they'll obscure the the reality of it. So the pyramids in China, why we're sharing this, ladies and gentlemen, is because we get into the second hour and deal with the 10 kings of Atlantis, from which pretty much all myths and legends emanate, when we get into the stargates, you might wonder why an expedition going to South America ends up in Sardinia first. Well, there's an answer to that, and we'll share that. But the most important thing is when you understand, and you'll see it, and Doug, I'm going to send this to you in a moment, okay, that the pyramids in China were planted, the black and white photos in 1947 after World War II, but very few Westerners are allowed to see it. Most people have seen the terracotta warriors of one of the emperors of China. But the point that is really pressing to all, and this is what we're trying to bring out to you, Jesus said that there's nothing that's been hidden that is going to be made known. That goes even for this. If the Christians are already being slaughtered worldwide simply because of their faith, the point is, and not only simply because of their faith, but because the devil's going about as a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour, then you've got to understand that whatever the final deception is, that they who control all the artifacts, all the bones, all of the manuscripts, whether it's the lost Library of Alexandria or the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, the point is that they will use all this in conjunction to basically present a world in which there is no prime creator, where there is no Jesus the Redeemer, and they're going to basically give you the biggest celestial hodgepodge backed up with archaeological evidence that they've spun and twisted to their benefit. Now, what Tim just said about the sinews and about his, not confidential informant, but the confidential interviewee matches exactly with everything that we're turning up, no pun intended, especially in the mummified remains. The thing that scares the entities that are, more than anything, is that something will pop up, maybe pun intended, and that the live DNA will be extracted. And so, obviously, and I told Tim this, I said, be careful on whatever labs we go to do the DNA testing, because even that show, In Search of the Ancient Giants, that's on whatever the channel it's on television, History Channel or A&E, you cannot expect a government-funded or government-controlled forensic lab to ever say anything beyond the party line. Does that make sense to you, Doug, as an investigator?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
In other words, if you want to,
I mean, Steve, it's we've always, anytime there is an investigation, if we're working for the defense, for example, we have to make sure any type of DNA or whatever forensic evidence is to be analyzed is done at a lab outside of the control of the prosecuting department, and that would extend toward what you're doing as well. You cannot have the History Channel or any other type of or any government-connected lab doing any analysis on any finds, for they control the report that is generated from the finds. So 100%. And I do suspect from our previous conversations that Steve, that this has been done many times in your case.
Well, yeah, it's done over and over. So. And Tim can get to it, but I'll just give you the punchline. They were followed. They had what I call a weasel, and everybody doesn't need me to define a weasel, but a plant, an agent, and obviously he spoke earlier when they would go into restaurants, the guys sit as close as they can, listening, police when they would go up to certain locations, driving by and giving them the glare and stare of death. So this stuff is sat on purpose. And see, one of the criticisms that's always levied against this whole stuff, well, where are the giant skeletons? I'm not talking about 9-footers. I'm not talking about anybody who were the tall people in history, that I even have on my website. We're talking about guys that go, anywhere from 15 to 28 feet and higher. And so the point, or taller. So the idea is, let me spell it out because I think this is critical, Tim, and I think it's critical, Doug. The whole point in covering up the existence of giants is to take away from the Genesis accounts truthful manifestation and to keep people in the dark. Now, obviously, those who can't wait for Lucifer to return to earth, and those who are jumping up and down, knowing that, quote, the Christians' time has come for their slaughter to begin of them. But even in the midst of all that's going down right now, the truth will be made known. So again, and Doug, am I saying this as clearly as can be said? They cover it up. They absolutely hide it. Paul says they hold the truth in unbelief. The point is that they do this in order to undermine the biblical narrative. Now, I'll just share this, Tim. I don't know if you saw it, but I believe National Geographic's coming out with a hit piece called the Attack on Science. I had one, I won't name him, but the most famous paleontologist in the world looked at my book and said to the young lady who's a Christian, he doesn't believe in science much, does he? No, I believe in real science. I don't believe in BS science, and I don't believe in the lying subterfuge. A good example, ladies and gentlemen, you were told all these years there was no water on Mars. Guess what? There's water on Mars now. You were told all these years the moon had no Mars or no water. Now you're hearing that. Microbes are being found. So they hold the truth as they basically lie about the truth. That's a better way to say it. So the reason I believe that Tim and I and Tom Horn and the others are going in this vein is because it's time to give. God isn't going to be taken, and this is a silly statement, forgive me, Lord, but nothing takes God by surprise. It may surprise us, it's surprising to us, but nothing takes him by surprise. So real simply, Doug, I'm going to send you, while Tim takes over, I'm going to send you the pyramids in China so people can compare and contrast it to what Tim posted of his trip to Sardinia, because the pyramids play a very important part. And Tim, do you want to go immediately into what the Sardinians said about their giants who came and took them, basically hired them, if you will, to build the pyramids? Do you want to go there now or wait?
Oh, well,
I think it might be good. Yeah.
Well, I was going to talk about some of the very interesting aspects of the giants that were found.
Okay, yeah, go there then first.
So I wanted to. I realized I didn't finish one of the things that I started to say, in that I felt like we were literally standing on giant bones, and we were told by different individuals that, in fact, if we were to dig down, we would find them. And at these graves, at the site that I was explaining a few minutes ago, I asked the guy that was with us, I said, so if we were to dig down right here, right where they covered this grave over, I said, are the giant bones still here? Did they take them? He said, no, there were too many for them to take. They took as many as they could, and they'll take them when they're apparent and people find them, in their backyard or whatever. But usually they just cover them over and plant trees. And I said, so how far down do we have to dig right here to hit the bones? And he told me a couple of meters. And of course, me and my buddy Darren looked at each other, and we thought, let's find a stick. But he warned us. He said, wait. He said, if you do that, you will be arrested. They will arrest you. And he said, just so you know, you can dig down, but you'll be arrested. And it wasn't like he wasn't telling us not to. He just wanted us to understand that there was a very good possibility that we were being watched, because he's always under surveillance. They even fly helicopters over his house and look down at his property with a ground penetrating radar. And anyway, so he told us, and he kind of stood back and he said, he didn't try to stop us. And I had the stick in my hand, and I thought, well, what would happen if what he's saying is true? And I dug down and found a bone and got arrested. They would wipe take all of our cameras and everything like that. So it wasn't worth the risk to us, even though it was very tantalizing, the idea of possibly digging down 2 meters in the ground and finding giant bones. But my point in saying that is that so many people, the older people in Sardinia, especially the ones that we talked to, it was very nonchalant to them. Yeah, there's bones there, there's bones there, there's bones there, there's bones there. And we were coming from a skeptical view. Giant bones are like 6.5 foot tall. No, 12 foot tall people, 15 foot tall people. I mean, giant bones, and it was so nonchalant. And one of the amazing things is the description of some of these skeletons. We had numerous kinds of hybrid giants described to us, many different kinds of configurations of horns, different elements of different animals. Some giants had pig-like heads. Some of these skeletons had skulls that looked like cow skulls. Some of them had beaks, and I found that fascinating because that is actually that's actually something that if you were going to make up a story about giants that coincided with some of the ancient manuscripts, that's the kind of details that would come out. I mean, and what I'm saying is a lot of these people were not familiar with ancient manuscripts. I mean, Sardinia, let's say Sardinia 100 years ago or 50 years ago, as it is to this day, is mainly, the interior of Sardinia is mainly just small villages, small Roman-type villages, small Italian-type villages with basically populations of people that are mainly farmers and we're not dealing with populations of highly educated individuals in the interior of Sardinia who would know about the ancient manuscripts and the account of Plato, of Atlantis, and all this different stuff. And yet here we're getting information that coincides with all kinds of information that we've come across in our research, and not only that confirms the biblical narrative, but that also confirms a lot of the other extra-biblical texts, and in terms of the descriptions of the giants, and in terms of the fallen ones coming and having intercourse with women, and then these creatures being born, again, of different kinds of giants. And of course, the Book of Giants talks about that the fallen angels, the 200 watchers that fell in the days of Jared, that they took 200 species of animal, and they purposely selected 200 different kinds of animals and copulated with them with the express purpose of creating life forms. And so when he's sitting there telling us about these giant skulls with different configurations of horns and beaks and the skull configurations of cattle or bulls or whatever, all I could think about was the Book of Giants, and how that's exactly what you would have had, according to the Book of Giants, and these fallen angels copulating with these animals. Because when the fallen angels copulated with women, you got giant humanoid creatures. So if the fallen angels are copulating with a bull, for example, you could expect, at least one might think you would expect, a giant bull-like humanoid bull creature, like a minotaur or something like that. And that's precisely what was being described to us, those kinds of creatures. So we found that to be extremely tantalizing information. And as a side note, there's a small island down in the south of Sardinia. I think it's actually connected to Sardinia. It's just a small little outcrop, and it's called, I'm probably going to botch the name here, but it's called St. Antiocho, I think. St. Antioch, probably the translation in English. I don't know. But recently they've discovered, and I'm pretty sure this was in the mainstream news, I have to do my homework on this, but definitely all the people attest to the fact that cyclops were discovered on that island. They dug up some quantity of giant cycloptic beings. So right here in Sardinia, we're finding evidence, at least we're getting testimony of hybridized giant creatures, including cyclops and minotaurs and creatures with beaks, and so this is getting, as we're going around taking a look at this stuff, talking to people, it's getting really, really, really interesting to us in terms of the historical documents and the ancient documents that we're aware of. So basically, to the cover-up, I'll talk a little bit about the cover-up. What's really interesting in Sardinia is that it was very apparent to everybody who knew anything about giants, and there was a lot of people who knew about giants, is that it was the Catholic Church that was always coming and taking the bones, and the Catholic Church was always involved in the cover-up. They'd always tell the people, don't think of, don't worry about those bones that you dug up in your backyard yesterday. Those are they're just demonic. Throw them away, get rid of them, or bring them to us. is basically what the narrative was, because we were told that it was so commonplace to dig up giant bones in Sardinia 50 years ago that people had a hard time plowing their fields sometimes because there were so many bones in certain areas. So basically, people who happened to have pieces of property that maybe were sitting on graveyards really had a hard time plowing the field, and they would routinely pull up gigantic hands and gigantic skulls and skulls with horns on them or cycloptic eyes or whatever. And so the Catholic Church routinely would build their churches, their sanctuaries, on top of known tombs of giants and in the vicinities of the areas that they knew for a fact had a lot of giant bones. They would purposely build their facilities on top of them, basically to control the information and to cover it up. And so this was it was fascinating to get the stories from people. One gentleman told us that he had his mom, I think it was his mother, who owned a piece of property that used to belong to the Catholic Church. There used to be a chapel built on it, but it was knocked down and they built their own house. One day he was digging in the basement. They were digging something out. They were going to add. They were digging a basement out, I think is what they were doing. And he just very nonchalantly, very candidly told us about how he dug up this massive hand and massive skull, and he's gradually unearthing this humongous being, this giant. And again, he told us another story about something to do with his dog digging in the ground and digging up a massive hand, and there was another gigantic skeleton. These kinds of stories, as fantastic as they sound, are everywhere in Sardinia. And that's really amazing to me because, people aren't coming out of the woodwork to tell us these stories. People are nervous about it. They've been told, there's nothing to see here, forget about it. The Catholic Church has told them, don't think about this, don't look at it, it's just demonic, and we'll take care of it, kind of a deal. But everybody who knew anything, and we got a few interviews on camera of individuals who work with the archaeological department of certain municipalities in Sardinia that actually went to dig up giant bones. They were involved in digging up giant humanoid skeletons in broad daylight, and of course the government was not surprised at all. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were going to unearth, to excavate these skeletons. They're always excavating the giant skeletons, and everybody tells us they go to the Vatican. And that was the common thread. I always ask people, where do the bones go? Who's taking the bones? And time again, we get the same answer: the Vatican, the Catholic Church, the Vatican. The bones are going to the Vatican. And people would very candidly tell us the Vatican knows all about what's going on in Sardinia and are basically the ones who are in charge of of burying, or who are responsible for burying the truth here. And so that was a very common thread that we were finding and that we document on film. By the way, many of these skeletons, another interesting detail, many of the skeletons that were found with gold armor. And I found that interesting because that kind of correlates to the copper armor that was found on the skeletons in the Americas, especially around the copper mines, around the Great Lakes. The ancient copper mine that is I believe it's still there to this day, but I don't think it's in use. There was a lot of gold in Sardinia, and so these giants were oftentimes unearthed with golden armor and different kinds of metals, but a lot of it seemed to me, the way it was described, as a sort of ornamental golden armor that they were buried with, and many giants were buried. We found a couple of accounts of giant skeletons that were buried, 4 giant skeletons buried in a cross configuration, which I found interesting. In other words, all the heads were touching, and there were 4 giants. That was something that popped up a couple of times, buried in a cross in a cross configuration under the ground. There's just a lot of details, very, very interesting details that we have recorded on camera, and that will be in our film. But where do you want me to go from here, Steve?
Well, I think people need to know that as you study Greek mythology, people can't separate myth from not only oral and written tradition, but Polyphemus was one of the Cyclops. And when you know it, Tim, he hung out in the very areas of Sicily and Sardinia, and there was a whole race of them. And Polyphemus, Polyphemos, they believe they even found his skeleton. I'll just take the last 2 minutes. No, we got 10 minutes left, don't we, Doug? I'm sorry, my eyes were reading the clock wrong. Yeah. Okay. Well, interestingly enough, the Cyclopean skeletons, one of them was found, and I found the documentation in a book that was written in 1850. As a matter of fact, so many skeletons of antiquity were very, very big. For the record, Polyphemus was said to be 400 feet tall. Now, people say to me, well, the law of inverse square won't allow for giants. The thing that people don't understand, Doug and Joe, that argument is offset by these are half fallen angel. And how do we overcome gravity? How do the secret spacecraft fly? They fly by using electrogravitics. So the point that most people that will argue against this, and I forget the name of the cube rooters, there's some, and I just can't think of it right now, but the point that I'm trying to bring across is simply this. These were half supernatural beings who had a life force that was so much stronger. And again, we're talking about both before the flood and after the flood. And in the second hour, we start talking about zeroing in on Atlantis and why this is important, is because the electricity, or if you will call it the force field or the life force of these things, were not bound by gravity. That's why even their voices could lift blocks that people say are impossible to move to this day. Well, the only way to overcome gravity is to basically interfere with the pressure that holds, let's say, 100-ton stone or something like the megalithic stones that the biggest ones they used to think are in Baalbek. Now they found them in Russia that make the Baalbek ones look like dominoes. So the point being is the harmonic levitation. Now, this is not a New Age term. This is a scientific principle, and the scientific principle, I think, Doug, we did a show together maybe 2 months ago where one of the science stories was talking about levitation. You remember that? They showed a ball levitating on sound. So the point is to see, again, it's a God stamp on this, meaning God is revealing. There's nothing that's hidden that won't be made known. So in knowing that, the very people that Tim's talking about, whether they're the Vatican, hey, Tim, go immediately to our friend when he was met by those two, what were they, bishops?
Yeah, that's what I was going to,
share that.
I was going to interject. Yeah, so okay. I won't tell, well, one of our contacts in Sardinia was telling us a story. We were walking through a particular area, actually right around where the first graves of the giants that we came upon were. He was telling us that he was visited, I forget how many years ago, by two bishops from the Vatican. And they wanted him to take them to a couple of particular sites, and they wanted him to tell them about what he had found there and what his thoughts are as to its significance. And it really had to do with Atlantis. So here he's telling us, and I don't know if this guy's telling us the truth, but this is the story he was telling us. Two bishops came from Rome, were standing right where we were at the time when he was telling us, asking him about the giants that the skeletons he discovered there, the structures that were once there, and what he believed it meant, and specifically in reference to Atlantis. And so he told them that he believed, and we'll get to this later on, that Sardinia was in fact Atlantis, and they were very, very interested in this, and they didn't offer any information themselves, but they were certainly very, very curious about what he found and what he thought the origins of what he found was. And before I forget, Steve, there's a little detail here that I wanted to interject, is that we were told by numerous people that it was not uncommon whenever there was excavation happening or rumors of giant bones or giant bones being burned out in the open when they were excavated, for men in black to show up. And that's exactly how they described it to us. A couple of different people, men in black, driving black cars in black suits or black sunglasses, would pull up to the scene and get out of the car and kind of survey what's going on and make sure that nobody's interfering. And, in fact, another one of our contacts told us there that he personally witnessed the excavation, he says, of 22 giant skeletons that they were excavating when he was younger. And the men in black pulled up, got out of the car, put a gun to his head and said, "Never speak of what you've seen here." And so that some pretty profound testimony concerning the cover-up there.
Steve, if I can interject this, just to go back a little bit, when you were talking about the pyramids in China, folks, if you go to HagmannandHagmann.com and click on the tonight's article there, just go ahead and click on that title. At the bottom right above, click here to listen live, is the link to the images for the pyramids in China that Steve and Tim were referencing earlier. So that's very simple. Go to HagmannandHagmann.com, click on the link right above the Listen Live link, and there you will see the images of the pyramids in China. And Tim, if I can just ask this question at this point, looking at, in preparation for the show today, I was trying to find out how Sardinia got on your radar. Sardis was the son of Hercules. And, of course, the Sardinia was named after Sardis, according to ancient accounts here. Does that have any relevance to what we're talking about at all tonight, or is that just is that nothing to do with this?
Actually, that's some new information to me. I didn't actually know that, and I find that to be very interesting, Doug.
Okay.
There's obviously a connection between obviously Greece and Italy and Egypt. The whole Mediterranean is connected. It's intrinsically connected. So, like Steve was talking about the Cyclops that was in the Sicily area. Well, there were also very similar cycloptic creatures that were found all throughout the Mediterranean, some of the different islands. I think Cyprus and some of the different. Obviously in Greater Greece, and there's stories of cycloptic creatures all over the Mediterranean. So I think the entire Mediterranean is going to be referenced with the Greek mythology, and obviously the Romans just borrowed the Greek mythology, just adapted it, changed the names. So that Greek mythology, I think it applies to the entire Mediterranean, and obviously also the mythology of the Egyptians. So again, that's very interesting. I did not know that, but I do find that to be very pertinent to what we're talking about here, Doug.
Hey,
cool.
Doug, I would like to make you're onto something, because listen, when you're dealing with all of the heroes, the mighty men of renown, they all go back to Genesis 6. And again, I've said this statement. People can knock, they can mock, they can say this isn't relevant, but it's very relevant, because what we're talking about is the return to those days. What we're talking about is the very stuff that Tom Horn and Chris Putnam have been warning about and teaching about on an accelerated basis. So what Tim is ultimately we can talk to, when you get down to the people that have been in the tunnels in Sardinia or in Corsica or in Mykonos and some of the other Greek islands, the interesting thing is they all talk about the civilizations that had subterranean tunnels even under the Mediterranean. Now, people might think that's far-fetched, but I'll tell you point blank that when you start talking about deep underground military bases and the magnetic levitating trains that we have today, people have got to understand that when Solomon said there's nothing new under the sun, for that which will be has already been. That's coming from the wisest guy in the world, not internet blogging critics, okay? So when you've got a historical context for that statement, that the world, even Queen of Sheba, came to cohabit with him because she wanted smart kids. And it's fascinating what tradition teaches about that. We can't go there tonight. But where we can go is this, is that when you're dealing with all of these cover-ups when you're dealing with all these locations. And most people would be probably flabbergasted to know that the Native Americans, especially the Apache, the Navajo, the Hopi, and others, the point is they knew their ancestors had, if you will, an underground civilization. And when the Hopi talk about the ant people, and the Word of God talks about the things coming up on the earth, UPON, meaning coming up from below. I put up a picture on my website the other day of a six-toed giant foot, and to the right of it was a spiral and kind of an ellipse on the top of the spiral and an ellipse on the bottom of the spiral. If you had turned it on its side, it would look like Saturn and its rings. But what that is basically saying, that specific location, and it was sent to me by one of my listeners in the Moab area. Thank you very much, my brother. I put it up on my website that it was courtesy of him. I won't put up anybody's last name to protect them, but he probably found one of the most, or whoever gave him that photograph, probably found one of the most significant things I've ever seen, because that's a portal that will take you either beyond the stars or literally into the bowels of the earth. So it's kind of a fascinating thing, Doug, that we're talking about this tonight, because the deception will be so great. I go to the London Daily Mail. They have some good stories. They got some of the best photo essays out there. But the point that's critical is to recognize that we all are being brainwashed. That which we behold, we become. So what I believe is if we behold the truth as always filtered through the Word of God, these are not old women's tales or anything like that, but the truth can be known, and the truth is what people are set free from. The fascinating thing is that we get testimonies and people, we really do. I don't even publish 1 out of 50 that we get, but the point is that the ones that are important I publish, and people are saying, thank you, you've answered the basic question that's kept me from giving my heart to Jesus. That number one question in many cases was, when God sent the children of Israel into the promised land, why did they kill men, women, and children? Because they weren't humans. And God was trying to preserve humanity from the attempt to breed it out. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't get what's going on in the world, the same thing that Satan tried to do through the fallen angels is being done through the propagation ratios of Islam right now, because they have made statements that worldwide they're on a spree to basically repopulate the world with their followers. So when you take a look at little kids holding human heads, when you take a look at little kids being taught how to cut people's heads off, when you see that, you'll learn that nothing new is under the sun, because the very same sacrifice of children was present in the place ancient Philistia, from which we get the word Philistines. So the critical thing in the giants is this: they overcome the traditional limitations of humanity, including gravity, and in certain aspects teleportation, because their fathers were the fallen angels. And Tim, I want to just point out real quick that the book of giants that Tim just referred to is on my website, free, Genesis 6 Giants, Genesis6Giants.com, and these are the Dead Sea Scrolls. So go to that, Genesis 6, lowercase, Genesis, the number 6, Giants.com, and go look at ancient texts. And when you start to understand this, it becomes really mind-blowing that the truth can set you free. I think we went over time, didn't we, Doug? So we better take a break.
Welcome back, folks, listeners from coast to coast worldwide, to the February 18th, 2015 edition of the Hagman Report. Special guest tonight, Steve Quayle, Genesis 6 Giants. That's Genesis, the number 6 Giants.com. Also SteveQuayle.com. Mr. Timothy Alberino, the Alberino Analysis. Folks, subscribe to his video channel. I've got to tell you, you'll learn a lot. Talking about Sardinia, Stargates, Pyramids, Giants, and Atlantis, and those who suppress history. Steve, I'm going to pop it back right to you. Take us wherever we need to go.
Well, I think it's important that we go to Atlantis and the legends surrounding it and the 10 kings, because everybody, I made the statement at the opening of the program that I'm not a classic dispensationalist. In other words, I don't think that in the vast universe that men get to see until God reveals it, the true nature of his multidimensional, multifaceted revelations out of his word. We read a sentence and take it at face value, and rightly we should, provided it's done on the law first mentioned. I mean, it's biblically accurate in the context of which it's applied. So, Tim, go ahead and share the history of Atlantis. Read, Critias or whoever you're going to read, Plato, and then when you're done, when you need a break, give it back to me, because most people don't realize that this is critical to the end times. This is so critical to the end times that we're talking about the 10 kings, and we go to Daniel chapter 2, and I'll read that a little later, that this is why it's critical. I told Tim, and Tim, this is pretty amazing. We're sitting in my office, maybe 3 weeks ago, and getting by the grace of God, and Cameron and your lovely wife, thank you so much. Thank you. Getting ready to plan the trip to South America, and lo and behold, it's all like God redirected us, and I think I understand it now, because the fruit, if you will, of history, everybody kind of gets pieces of that. Tonight we're going to the root of it. Go ahead, Tim, and take away on Atlantis, because it's that critical.
Okay, well, first of all, Steve and I were not thinking Atlantis at all when I went to Sardinia. It wasn't even on the radar for us. We weren't looking for anything related to Atlantis. Again, as I said earlier in the beginning, we were specifically going to take a look at certain artifacts that were purported to be bones and remains of giants. And so again, Atlantis was not even on the radar for us, wasn't even in my mind. But interestingly enough, it wasn't in my mind concerning Sardinia, as it relates to Sardinia, as it relates to the expedition to Sardinia, it wasn't in my mind. However, the last analysis that I did, the last analysis, the title of it escapes me right now, but it was the third installment of the Plumed Serpent series. Exiles of Atlantis was the title of it, and for some reason, and I've told Steve this, I've been really in Atlantis for the last 6 months. I couldn't get my mind off of it. I really wanted to understand it. There was something there. I knew that it was such a big puzzle piece, even though most people just considered Atlantis to be mythos, Disney kind of stuff. I knew that Atlantis was important to understanding the future. And because there's so much mythos surrounding Atlantis, it's hard to cut through all the BS, basically, and get down to something substantive when dealing with Atlantis. There's so many misconceptions. There's so much information that has been derived by means of channeling entities in the New Age that it is very, very difficult to distill anything of historic value when it comes to Atlantis. But I was working on the Plumed Serpent analysis, the third part, which is not the final part. The last part is the one I'm working on now. It's called the New Atlantis, so it ties into what we're talking about tonight. But I was working on this Plumed Serpent, the part 3 of this Plumed Serpent series, the Exiles of Atlantis, and I really was drawn to the idea that there's a connection here. There is a correlation between, which I won't get to in this show, between the United States of America as it is now and where it's headed, and the ancient legend, mythos, and reality, in my opinion, of Atlantis. And so this correlation was beginning to take shape in my mind, and I was doing my own investigations, and I turned up some pretty astounding things, at least to my own knowledge, that I hadn't known before. And so I was very steeped in studying about Atlantis before I went to Sardinia. Just cut out the Plumed Serpent Part 3, Exiles of Atlantis, and I thought, I guess that's it in terms of studying Atlantis. That's where it ended for me, and I headed off to Sardinia to look for evidence of giant bones. Well, what I ended up finding, in my estimation, is evidence for Atlantis as well as evidence for giant bones, which the two go together. For anybody who knows anything about the mythos of Atlantis in almost every single account, whether it be historical accounts, or whether it be, and when I say historical accounts, I mean the ones that come down to us from Plato and some of the other people, and the ones that come down to us through channeling, which is obviously not as reliable a source, although I will say that although Satan is the father of lies, and these entities that speak to people and that control people, their ultimate goal is to deceive the human race and to deceive people, they do give people a lot of truth. Now, that is by no means a sanction for anybody to go and seek knowledge from these entities, because it will always lead to death and damnation ultimately. So, but anyways, I wanted to preface what I'm about to say with that little bit of background, so people get the idea of where my mind was before I went to Sardinia. I was on to Atlantis, but I pushed that aside, and I was just thinking about giant bones. Atlantis wasn't even on my radar or on Steve's when I set out for Sardinia. But when I got to Sardinia, and when I started to talk to some individuals, some of the first things that they started to talk to me about was Atlantis. And I wasn't interested in hearing about Atlantis from them. I wanted to know about these artifacts that they had, and, you know, where are the giant skeletons buried, basically. But they kept insisting on this narrative of Atlantis, and I kept pushing it away, and it just seemed like a distraction. I wasn't there to look for Atlantis. I was there, again, to look at these artifacts. And basically, as we began to travel around Sardinia with our guide, and began to look at some of the structures, some of them that were still standing in part, and most of them just rubble, just big megalithic blocks laying around. And I began to start to wake up to the fact that there was something very, very significant going on in ancient Sardinia. Let me make this clear right off the bat here before I start getting into the details of the Atlantis connection. I believe that what I found in Sardinia is evidence of both, and this is important, of both pre and post-flood civilizations and giants. In other words, evidence of structures and giants from before the flood of Noah and from after the flood of Noah. And there's a big difference between the giants that were before the flood and the giants that were after the flood. From my studies, what I've turned up in my own studies, and I think Steve could probably attest to this as well, is that a lot of the post-flood giants, what appear to be post-flood giants, are a lot of times between 9 and 12 feet tall. But a lot of the more ancient accounts and a lot of what I believe are more ancient ruins suggest a race of giants that is more in the more in the ballpark of 15 to 30 feet tall, like Steve was referencing earlier. In fact, in some of the ancient accounts, one of them in particular, the Book of Dizion, that purportedly comes down from ancient Tibet, which Madame Blavatsky published and talked about. They have an account of Atlantis, which says that the Atlanteans were 28 feet tall, and that they made statues of themselves that were anatomically correct. In other words, statues that were around 30 feet tall. And that's not the only account of ancient Atlanteans being of that size. So I believe, it's my own personal opinion, that and I think it's borne out in the ancient manuscripts, that the pre-flood civilization and the pre-flood giants was on a far grander scale in terms of sheer magnitude and size than the post-flood civilization of giants and the post-flood tribes of giants that are detailed in the Bible, and with great detail, actually, numerous tribes that were obviously tribes of giants. So I think in Sardinia we were looking at both together, and maybe later on we'll go into maybe why that is and how that happened. But I started to notice that the megalithic stones that were lying around, and when you drive through Sardinia, again, let me make it clear, if you get a brochure on Sardinia and you want to go to the tourist sites, what are the ancient ruins and the touristic places, the historical places, you're not going to find the places that we went to. In fact, I don't think, maybe one of the places that we went to is listed as an actual historic spot in Sardinia. The rest of the places that we went to, we hopped over fences and we walked through trees planted in rows to get to them. And the megalithic stones that were lying around, some of them were massive. I mean, absolutely comparable to the stones that are used in the Great Pyramids. I forget how many tons those are, Steve, but definitely comparable to those those sized megalithic stones. And the structures, many of which, not all of which, some of which were to me obviously post-flood structures that could have been built, are alleged to have been built by giants and humans. That's a whole other story. There was a mixture, a race that they lived together at one time on the island. But a lot of the structures that we saw, from my perspective, were definitely not your common Carthaginian or Roman ruins. These things were massive. Obviously, something very large once stood in some of these places based on the size of the megalithic stones. And something that we found on almost every megalithic site we went to that appeared to be, to our own estimation, a pre-flood site because of the magnitude and the size of the blocks that were used. Almost every site, in fact, let me say every site that we went to that fits into that specific category, the megalithic stones, many of them had a covering, had a plastered layer of quartz on the outside of them. In other words, quartz plastered on the outside. And the individual we were with began to tell us how the legend says that the ancient civilization that used to exist in Sardinia before the Great Flood destroyed it, that's what the legend says in Sardinia, was they were giants, number one. Number two, they were destroyed in the Great Flood. And number three, they built these massive structures, and there's more details than three, but they built these massive structures that were purposely plastered with quartz on the outside so that, and we were told that it would function, it would basically, he described it as a city of lights, a city that was illuminated in the day, structures that were illuminated in the day by the sun, the reflection of the sun on the quartz would cast these colors all over the facets of the edifices that were there. The gigantic pyramids and the different structures that were there would literally shine and glisten in the sun during the day, and then at nighttime they would glow in the moonlight. And so now things are starting to click in my head as I'm looking at these quartz covered blocks, where it's obvious that just one side of the block is covered in quartz. And especially where the block is turned over and it wasn't exposed to weathering over who knows how many thousands of years, you reach your hand underneath the block and there is a uniform layer of quartz. And even on the sides and stuff, the sides that were exposed to the sun and the weather, the quartz is still there, but it's weathered away in some spots. But it was just amazing because in the quartz, it looked like somebody took a concrete mixture and plastered the quartz on, and it was about, I'd say, 2 inches to 3 inches thick of quartz crystals plastered on to the outside of a lot of these structures, and that were obviously in ruin and laying around on the ground. And so this began to really trigger some things in my head because I had heard legends of Atlantis, and not only Atlantis, some of the great cities of Mu and some of the great cities of the Rama Empire, and some of these civilizations, which I believe were pre-flood civilizations, that they were shining cities, that their edifices shined and that they reflected the sunlight. We know that the pyramids in Egypt had a layer of, I forget what it was, Steve, I think it's slate or something that was plastered onto the outside, or that was stacked onto the outside of the pyramids so that it would glisten and shine in the sun. So this was a common theme, and which might have something to do with producing energy and some other things. But I found this to be fascinating because I began to imagine in my mind as I was at these areas of just everywhere you look is megalithic blocks just scattered all across the countryside. And it becomes obvious really quickly in Sardinia that there was something, again, like I said, beginning this description here, that there was something massive and important that once stood in at least in the areas that we were in Sardinia. And everywhere we looked as we drove to these different spots, and interestingly enough, a lot of the material, the rock that was used wasn't just a solid indigenous rock. It was a concrete. It was a concoction. It was ancient concrete. In fact, I brought a couple of samples of it home because I think that what we're looking at in Sardinia was antediluvian concrete. And that fascinated me because you had these blocks that appeared to be made out of some kind of ancient concrete plastered with quartz. And one of the guys that I was with, we wanted to take a sample of the quartz home, and we were trying to break it off of the concrete, of this ancient concrete. And we could not break this concrete. I mean, we were smashing it against rocks and taking big rocks and just hitting it as hard as we could. I mean, we couldn't hardly break off little chips of this concrete. So this is ancient concrete, I believe, antediluvian, in other words, pre-flood concrete that is comparable or probably most likely far surpasses the concrete that we have today. And so I was now imagining, everywhere I went, I was imagining these magnificent, massive structures, pyramids and buildings and columns and statues covered in quartz. And I began to think, wow, there was something really, really unique and incredible here, because I've never seen anything like some of the stuff I was seeing. I'm used to seeing blocks, for example, in Sacsayhuaman in Peru, that, the typical what I believe is antediluvian construction, where they take the massive blocks that they quarry miles away, these massive blocks that even our modern cranes would have a hard time dealing with. They transport them miles. In the case of Sacsayhuaman, 10 miles away. They quarry them, cut them, and they fit them with such precision into the wall or whatever it is, whatever edifice that they're going into, with such precision that there is no need for mortar. And I mean, you can't even stick a razor blade between. And that's whole pieces of stone. I mean, stone that's literally quarried and cut in whole chunks. But what we were looking at in Sardinia was concrete. And there is a mine. There is a quartz mine in Sardinia that I believe is still active to this day. So it's obvious that they had plenty of quartz. They probably didn't have an abundance of just raw rock to quarry like in Peru, so they made concrete. And they plastered it with quartz, and we're dealing with a very highly advanced, sophisticated civilization, and that was becoming apparent very, very rapidly. In fact, the very first thing we went to look at was just a field of rubble, and again, all of this is on film. A field of rubble, and it was evident that something was standing there, had been knocked down. We were told that all the columns and all the largest pieces of this edifice were hauled away a long time ago, some 15 years ago. I guess that's not really a long time ago, considering that in other places of the world, that stuff was moved away 100 years ago. But in Sardinia, 15, 20 years ago, most of this stuff was hauled away, the remnant of these edifices. And so we were looking across an area that was just rubble. It was just rubble. Obviously, there was a large structure standing there. It was like a road of just, like a field of rubble of this concrete and of this cement, of this ancient cement. And we were told that there once stood a hospital there. And legend has it that it was the first hospital ever built in the world, on Earth. And in fact, that place was called something about the hospital. We wanted to get a picture of the sign that actually indicated that place was the site of an ancient hospital, because they actually had a sign for it. There used to be a road paved with megalithic stones that they just paved right over it with asphalt. And there's no indication that this is a touristic site, by the way, nothing, except for the one little sign that says something about the hospital. That's it. There's nobody there. Every place we went, practically, except for one place that we weren't even able to get into, we were the only ones there. I mean, it was bizarre. There was nobody else there taking pictures, no signs, no indication that this is a touristic area or, hey, there's something interesting here. In fact, as I've been saying this whole time, just the opposite. Fences and trees planted in rows. and remnants of something that once stood there, and obviously, whatever was there was taken away. That's what we found almost everywhere. And so basically this one particular site was supposed to be the hospital. And the way they were describing it to us was this was a very advanced hospital. And one of the guys that was with us was talking about how when he was a little kid, he used to come up there and they used to play, and they would find advanced instruments, surgical instruments. In other words, like I forget the terminology for this stuff, is the little knives that they use in surgery, and some advanced looking apparatuses.
Scalpels.
Scalpels and different kinds of metal, and he was describing it to us, and he said they would literally used to find it mixed into the rubble, all kinds of crazy stuff he was describing. And one of the interesting things is, while I'm thinking of this, and I'm getting up to the Atlantis connection here, I'm kind of trying to walk people through what I'm starting to open my eyes to and realize.
Tim, hold on a minute, because I want to interject something. I think it's important. Most people think when Tim gets into Critias, and Solon of Egypt, most people don't know that there are pre-Platonic writings concerning Atlantis, especially the Egyptians, obviously, Solon of Egypt. And I put up on my website, Doug, and we did a show on it. I think it was either with you or maybe, I'm sorry, it could have been George Norrie on Coast to Coast, but the Babylonian seal of kings that goes back 250,000 years. Now, what I want to make it clear is we're talking, I believe that, and so does Tim, that Adam and Eve were created exactly with the biblical time frame. But what we're talking about is both the biblical time frame and then the pre-biblical time frame that the Egyptians talked about, the reign of the gods. And let me just say this, because this will bounce you right in, Tim, that in the Great Hall of Ramesses at Karnak, there is mention, okay, and this is by Harold T. Wilkins, one of the most famous scholars in the world from Cambridge, who basically said that this is on one of the pillars, the loss of a drowned continent in the Western Ocean. Now, I am not saying either as Tim that Sardinia is Atlantis, but we're saying is that a lot of it fits Atlantis, but people need to understand when God destroyed Atlantis, the God of heaven, it was because they were messing around with human and animal DNA. Now, I say that because there's nothing new under the sun. What are we doing right now? We're messing around with human, animal, and vegetable DNA. In all, there were 10 of these so-called God kings. If you will, and Ramesses, I think, was second, ruled for 66 years in Egypt. He had one of the longest reigns of any of the pharaohs. But what's fascinating is that the 10 Atlantean god kings were said to have reigned in a foreign country. And from all appearances, they were called Atlanteans. Now, there's words that they used that they were called the Aludians, and that's basically by Manetho, Manetho, who had a thing called the Table of Kings. But when you put all this together, okay, and this is where we're going, and this is where you got to jump into this, Tim, on Plato, because the point is that we're almost halfway through the second hour. We're wetting your whistles, ladies and gentlemen, because what we're going to do by the grace of God and by your intercession and your help, and it is to basically lay this out in such a linear and coordinated fashion that you, in essence, get the keys to understanding history. We encourage you all to pray about this. We encourage you all to take it to the Lord. We encourage you, these 10 God kings, what happened to them when they died, or did they? Fallen angels, let me make this clear, Tim, because sure enough, fallen angels do not die. According to Mahabharata and some of the Vedic texts of India, the wars that took place prior even to the creation of Adam and Eve were very much related to the events that were taking place both before the flood and after the flood. So what is critical for people to understand tonight is that we are at a time now where the things that have been hidden are going to be revealed. And again, because, now, this is important. I believe the purpose of the Lord in having us deal with this after much prayer isn't to entice you with old fables, but to show you that through a coordinated effort of suppression, murder, and all sorts of intrigue, the truth has been kept from you. Because people cannot and you cannot do it. The lying devils from hell in the scientific community, the ones that are in what I call black science, that's the true science that you get only invited into as you become a Luciferian. They know good and well this history. So the point is that which has been hidden from you is now being revealed to you, brothers and sisters, so that you might take it to the Lord and you might say, oh, I get it now. I get it now. And so the point is that obviously an evolutionary biologist, okay, is not going to have an easy time explaining giants and the DNA. Do you remember, Tim, when everybody said, Doug, that good night Neanderthals are part of our early development when we kind of crawled out of the pond and became scum, and then from scum we became salamanders? Now, I'm mocking this, okay? There is no way to explain the architecture. There is no way to explain the hidden civilizations and the pyramids all line up with celestial coordinates. There is no way to explain that in an evolutionary model. There is no way to explain the giant skeletons. There is no way to explain all of the great architectural facts. And by the way, one of the things I've learned, and having written Genesis 6 Giants, I don't know, however many, 10, 12, 14 years ago, I have to come out now, and I'm coming out with a new version of that in which I detail all the ancient giants because they blew my mind. I did not know how big Polyphemus was, and I did not know of all the records of some of these guys that were so huge that the Colossus of Rhodes, if you look at the Colossus of Rhodes up, it was one of the ancient wonders of the world. It stood just a little under 100 feet in the harbor of Rhodes. That was a life-size statue. So gravity has changed. Climate has changed. What affected longevity, and I think the best explanation of longevity from a biblical standpoint is by Donald Patton, Patten, the Biblical Flight and Ice Epic. Men's lifespans were shortened dramatically after the flood. But when you go into the Babylonian Table of Kings, some of these kings ruled for 66,000 years, 25,000. Remember this, we're not talking about human beings at that point. And the Egyptians believed that they were the descendants of the gods. The Egyptians, does anybody want to put it together? All their mitres, their crowns are always in the shape of a Paracas skull pretty much. Well, the idea was that they became the elite because the gods, and people worshipped the pharaohs as God. Obviously, Moses didn't. Obviously, the children of Israel did not. And when the Hebrews were led out of Egypt in the promised land, a lot of them couldn't get Egypt out of their heart to get the promised land into their heart. And therefore, many of them perished in the wilderness. But that's neither here nor there. So I want to make it clear. People say, well, there's only one guy who talked about it, and that's Plato. Not true. Not true, and we don't have time to go through them all tonight. But, Tim, go ahead and read what Plato said about it, because, again, neither Tim or I are saying that this could be a wonderful. One obvious thing is if there were 10 kings that ruled the Mediterranean world, and these were all giants, and the Atlanteans were giants, and is it not true, Tim, that the Sardinians see themselves as the offspring of Atlantis, don't they?
Yeah, some of the Sardinians who know about the giants are proud of the fact that they're descended from giants. In fact, we found out that there is an unusual frequency of people who are born with 6 fingers, 6 toes. I think a few years ago, I think it was a few or 10 years ago, a woman in the town that we were in, the town that we were staying in, recently died either 3 or 10 years ago, and she had horns. And our contacts would tell us basically, yes, that's because the ancient Sardinians were mingled with the bloodline of the Atlanteans, and some people still have that bloodline, which basically is the bloodline of monsters, really, in many cases. So, but as Steve was saying, there's a lot of different accounts of Atlantis under different names. It's like Atlantis is inextricably connected to the universal flood, what people call the universal flood mythos. It's obviously not a mythos. It's a matter of biblical fact. And so Atlantis is connected to that, and I'll explain why in a minute. But the most famous and detailed account of the fabled Atlantis does come down to us from Plato in the 4th century BC in his work Critias. And in the Critias, Plato recounts a dialogue between Solon of Athens and an old Egyptian priest of the goddess Neith. And Neith is Athena to the Greeks. The Egyptians, both the Egyptians and the Greeks, worshipped the goddess Athena. Again, to the Egyptians, it was Neith. And so basically, Solon of Athens visited the district of Sais in Egypt, and he had this conversation with the Egyptian priests of the goddess Neith. And reading from the Critias, the tale, which was of great length, began as follows. I have before remarked in speaking of the allotments of the gods, that they distributed the whole earth into portions differing in extent, and made themselves temples and sacrifices. And Poseidon, receiving for his lot the island of Atlantis, begat children by a mortal woman. He, Poseidon, also begat and brought up 5 pairs of male children, dividing the island of Atlantis into 10 portions. He gave the firstborn of the eldest pair his mother's dwelling and the surrounding allotment, which was the largest and best, and made him king over the rest. The others he made princes and gave them rule over many men and a large territory. And he named them all, the eldest who was king, he named Atlas, and from him the whole island and ocean received the name of Atlantic. Now I want to stop there. I'm not going to read too much from the Critias because it's a very long account, and there's a lot of details that people can go and look up Plato's Critias. You can find it all over the internet for free. And there's a lot of details that he describes that pertain to Atlantis, the way that it was the city of Atlantis, the island, some things I'll get into here in a little bit. But what I want to point out here is that this tale of Atlantis, which the priests of Sais in Egypt are accounting to Solon, and it's being recorded by Plato here, is basically the trademark of antediluvian civilization. This account, the historic, I should say, the mythical account of Atlantis, I believe, is an analogy of the historical account of the antediluvian world as it relates to the Genesis 6 affair. In other words, here we have in this tale that from the Egyptian priests, that the gods came down and they divided the earth into portions among themselves. So now let's think of this in terms of, and again, this story, by the way, can fit into either a pre-Adamic or a pre-flood context. I personally think it leans more towards a pre-flood context, but that's open for interpretation, because I believe that, and obviously as Steve does, in the pre-Adamic world, in 2 floods, one before Adam and then one during the time of Noah. So, but anyways, this story is basically laying out the scenario of Genesis 6. The Watchers come down. There were 200 Watchers according to the Book of Enoch, and they divide the earth into portions among themselves. And obviously here we have Poseidon, the Greek mythological figure of Poseidon, taking for his lot the island of Atlantis. And later on we're told in the story that there's a particular human woman who's on the island of Atlantis that he goes and takes as a wife. And as I just read, has children by her, 10 sons specifically, and they were giants. So obviously what we have here is a Genesis 6 narrative, is the Book of Enoch narrative of the Watchers coming down, dividing the earth into portions. And according to Plato's account, Atlantis was ruled by 10 kings, as Steve referenced earlier, whose father was a god, but whose mother was human. Again, Genesis 6 narrative. What Plato does not reveal is that these 10 hybrid kings of Atlantis were, in fact, giants. And so many of the other accounts record these 10 kings as giants. Now, let me say at this juncture that there is an ancient Sardinian legend that says that one of the gods took the island of Sardinia as his territory. He took a human woman as a wife and begot 10 giant male sons. This is an ancient Sardinian legend. Begot 10 giant male sons who later became the kings of ancient Sardinia. So now we're starting to weave in the Atlantis connection here. And I want people to keep in mind that these stories that we were told by some of the Sardinian people who we talked to were the ancient stories that came down from their grandfathers and their grandfathers' grandfathers back to the generations, that this is the stories that came down. Now, going back, I don't know how many generations, but once you get back maybe 3 or 4 generations, you're probably dealing with a predominantly illiterate group of people who probably would have never even knew who Plato was, let alone have read his Critias, the unfinished work of Plato's Critias. So we're dealing with both the Atlantis, so people don't get lost here. We're dealing both with the historical account of Plato in his work, the Critias, of Atlantis, and weaving in here the ancient Sardinian legends concerning the island of Sardinia that run parallel with this account, Plato's account, specifically Plato's account of Atlantis. So what we have in the story of Atlantis is at the very least an allegory of the antediluvian world order, what I call the old world order, in which the fallen angels distributed the whole earth into portions among themselves and became each the god of his own realm, appointing the their giant hybrid sons as the kings. So one of those, let's just call it one of those watchers, took this island that became legendary, became known throughout the world as Atlantis. Another fallen angel went and took a different part of the earth and took a wife and had giant children who ruled that part of the earth. And there are many stories of the antediluvian world that come from the antediluvian world, or that purport to come from the antediluvian world, of highly advanced civilizations, very similar to Atlantis. In fact, many of them are considered to be contemporaries of Atlantis. So Atlantis wasn't just Atlantis was one city in the antediluvian world, one empire among many, which I believe all of which were ruled by the giant hybrid children of the fallen angels. Manly P. Hall makes this statement in his book, The Secret Destiny of America. The Critias first describes the blessed state of the Atlantean people under the benevolent rulership of 10 kings who were bound together in a league. These kings were monarchs over 7 islands. Now that is precisely what the ancient Sardinian story is, the ancient Sardinian tale is, that the people there were telling us came passed down from their generations, behind them, that obviously, as I said before, that the island was ruled by 10 giant kings, and they were monarchs. It was an empire. And they say that Sardinia was Atlantis. This is what they say now. This is what the Sardinians were telling us, that Sardinia was Atlantis, ruled by 10 kings, and it was, who were bound together in a league, and it was an empire. It was the center of an empire, the Atlantean Empire. And so 10 kings bound together in a league is the subject of biblical prophecy concerning a final world empire that will arise before the end of the age. Now, by the way, I'm reading from my notes from the last analysis I did. I detail a lot of this in the last analysis I did, the Exiles of Atlantis. But so basically, when I was looking into this, the stuff about Atlantis, the mythos about Atlantis, I started to realize that Atlantis, that the number 10 and 7 are always popping up in the mythos of Atlantis. 10 kings, 7 regions that they ruled, or 7 islands, and some different accounts say 7 islands and so many continents, or some say 7 continents and so many islands. But you have the number 10 and 7. And this was fascinating to me because, as I just said, 10 and 7 are numbers that signify, that are found in the Bible, and that signify the domain and authority of the dragon and his beast in the book of Revelations. So I started to think, wait a minute, there's a connection between Atlantis and the book of Revelations. At least in my mind, in my own research, was basically discovering this strange coincidence between the story of Atlantis and the kingdom of Antichrist at the end of the age. And so this is the why does it matter coming in here. So basically, there's a handful of scriptures that I can reference. I'll reference Revelations 12:3 to give you an illustration of this. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his heads. Now, we're told what this represents in Revelation 17, 7, verse 7 and 12. I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. So both the dragon of the book of Revelation has 7 heads and 10 horns, and the beast, which are 2 separate entities in the book of Revelation, the dragon and the beast. So the dragon, the 10 horns which you saw, are 10 kings who have received no kingdom as yet, but they receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. Again, that's Revelation 17, 7 and verses 7 and 12. So suddenly we have this interesting parallel between the mythos of Atlantis and the final empire that will appear on this planet at the end of the age. We have in both situations 10 kings who are ruling over 7 regions. So geographically speaking, it's interesting to note that the earth is divided, as it is now, is divided into 7 divisions of land or continents. So the 7 islands of the Atlantean Empire serve as a symbolic representation of the 7 continents of the earth, in my estimation, and therefore of world domination. So basically, Atlantis epitomizes the old world order in which the gods mingled themselves with the seed of men, which is the story of Atlantis, and generated hybrid offspring to rule the earth. I believe that the coming New World Order, like Atlantis, is going to also be ruled, I believe it's biblical, by 10 hybrid kings. This is where, again, I want people to start to at least consider that there is a connection between the mythos of Atlantis, what I consider to be historical Atlantis, because I believe Atlantis was a literal island and kingdom. So the mythos and history of Atlantis and the final empire of the Antichrist, which I believe is already beginning to amalgamate, to come together, to rise in this age in which we live. So this is why it's important. I think there's some clues here to Atlantis that will shed light on what's happening right now in the world. Basically, Steve, I don't know if you want to reference. You mentioned the Daniel chapter 2, the statue. I think you were probably going to talk about the statue of Nebuchadnezzar, right?
Right. Actually, Daniel chapter 2. Let me just read that, Tim, because I think it's important. Okay. And for so long, people just haven't figured out. Now, Daniel was the end-time prophet, and God told him at the end of Daniel, seal it up, Daniel, or the angel did, for the vision is yet for an appointed time. I'm doing this; it's not verbatim. For knowledge shall run to and fro. But again, what we're referring to in the book of Daniel is obviously a great image. What you're talking about, and starting Daniel 2, chapter 2, verse 30. I'm confused here. But as for me, the secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom that I have more than any living. But for their sakes that shall make known the interpretation of the king, and that thou mightest know thy thoughts of thy heart. Thou, O king, sawest and behold a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form was terrible. This image head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Thou sawest till a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them into pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, silver, and gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. The stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. And basically it goes on, and talks about the different kingdoms. But the part that we want to get to, talking about the final kingdom, as the fourth, verse 40, and The fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, for as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things, and as iron that breaketh all these things shall it break in pieces and bruise. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it the strength of iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay. And it goes on to say there, and basically the idea is, let's see, where am I going? I'm going here to the verse that says that, they will not mingle, okay, with the seed. They're going to try and mingle with the seed. That seed is the seed of man. And I believe Daniel is talking about what Tim just shared with you. Tim, to my knowledge, and look, this isn't about who said it first, but to my knowledge, very few people, if any, have ever put the return of the 10 kings of Atlantis in with the basically, the prophetic filling of that, because again, I don't think it was time. Verse 43, and whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. Notice that God's even talking about human marriage. For this reason shall a man cleave unto his wife. And in the days of the king shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. So, ladies and gentlemen, again, I guess if you get anything out of this show tonight, the attempt to understand prophecy in a secular and historic framework without bringing in probably the most profound supernatural revelation. It's just like, Tim, you've heard me say it on talk radio when you used to listen to me. The book of Revelation isn't a bunch of bad stuff getting ready to happen. It's Jesus is the only one worthy, the Son of God, our Redeemer who bought our eternal souls with his precious blood. He's the only one worthy to open the seals. So I believe that what you got while you went there, I really do. Ladies and gentlemen, understand, we're planning the expedition to South America. God puts a redirect into our life. And I give credit to whom credit due, honor to whom honor is due, and all glory, honor, power, and praise be unto him, the Ancient of Days. Because, again, what happened is we're at that time, Tim, the lateness of the hour. Now, imagine this. Imagine the Vatican and everything that they've been doing, ladies and gentlemen, looking for an alien savior. Tom Horn is explained that in great detail. The description of them sounds like something out of the Middle Ages and a gargoyle. But these entities, these 10 kings, to the degree that the children became, their children, the giants, died, but the fallen angels have not been killed. Fallen angels don't die. They can be chained in everlasting chains to darkness, the first incursion into the human race. But the point is that CERN and all of the diabolical work that's going on is to release these things. And if God basically put them in, I guess you'd say, a form of non-intervention with humans for a time, then the humans go and turn their back on God, and the word of the Lord is that, Mystery Babylon becomes a habitation for devils. I think that what Tim, and I still think this, it gives me shivers, I think what the Lord was showing you, showing me, showing us, is that the historic context is accurate as it dealt with the kingdoms, the gold, the silver, the four great kingdoms, revival of the Holy Roman Empire. But based on everything I know, based on everything you know, based on the cover-up, based on new both archaeological, biblical, and astronomical dating, based on new findings, and based on the technology that is now here that explains why the living God of heaven destroyed Atlantis and the other civilizations that messed around, destroyed the great empires of the world prior to, obviously, in the dateless past. The point is, Jeremiah chapter 4 is not talking about Noah's flood. So it's critical, ladies and gentlemen, that you understand. Doug, do you understand, and I'm just asking, I want to make sure I'm clear and Tim's clear, the significance of what Tim just said as it relates to
Absolutely.
the unfolding of the final kingdom?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, yeah. I mean, I don't think anyone has made it more clear than Tim on tonight's program.
Yep. Well, let's take a break and come back. We'll let Tim talk, because, look, we're just scratching the surface, and I'll say this in 30 seconds or less. This whole thing will be edited into a very coherent and amazing production. You'll be able to see part of it on TV. Tom Horn, when he goes live on Skywatch, will be carrying interviews and stuff. But this is what it's all about. The reason God tells us the future, and he is the only one that can declare the beginning from the end and the end from the beginning, is to have us that see that ye not be shaken, and also to be able to endure. The greatest antidote for fear is the truth. And what Tim Alberino just shared, I think, is one of the most remarkable revelations that has been time-sealed and open tonight for all to ponder. Don't take my word. Don't take Tim's word. Go take it to the Lord and pray. Go ahead.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to a very special edition of the Hagman Report. It's a live broadcast, the 18th day of February 2015. Guest, Mr. Steve Quayle from stevequayle.com, Genesis6Giants.com, Timothy Alberino, the Alberino Analysis. Folks, if you go to Hagman.com, you'll see the banner on the right-hand side for stevequayle.com. Right underneath that is the banner for Timothy Alberino's YouTube channel. You've got to bookmark that. Check that out. It's a fantastic resource for all of this information. And Stephen, Tim, for your information, we have I've been getting reports people cannot listen. The reason is this: we have. I believe we have, on a normal day, we have, I believe, 100 telephone lines set up for us. We got bumped up to 500. All are filled, and the bandwidth is just being strained. These are legitimate listeners from all over the world. So for those people who are not hearing this live, I'm catching on the archive, and we thank you for your patience. It's just a tremendous draw on this topic, a very important topic, to be certain. And the last thing I want to mention as well, folks, real quick, if you haven't made plans to meet us at the Prophecy Summit in Orlando, please do so. The seats are going fast there. We want to get you in and meet you face-to-face, definitely. And last announcement here, Joe should be back in the office tomorrow. He's healing well from surgery today. God bless him. Thank you for your prayers. Thank you for your support. Thank you for your understanding as I muddle through this technological nightmare by myself. Steve, going to kick it right to you, sir. Fantastic program.
Well, I think Doug, that is critical tonight because, again, Tim, I want you to address this. Here, this is from Lisa. She said, Steve, listening to you on Hagman talking about Atlantis, just wondering what you think about this idea. In Revelation, it says a beast is coming out of the sea, and as we all know, Atlantis is under the sea. Well, not necessarily. Kind of makes sense. What do you think? Because you're onto this, 10 Kings of Atlantis, I think it was Edgar Casey. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, when I refer to this, it's in the historic sense. I do not endorse anything psychic. I don't do it. But what I'm saying is even the powers of hell announce their movement. I'm not claiming Casey was from hell. I'm just saying this, that Atlantis would rise. Everybody thought it would literally come up of the ocean. But also, even with Atlantis rising, could Tim, even this whole, if you will, reference to and I guess say God shining the light on Atlantis, what are your thoughts about, could it be the beast that rises out of the sea?
Well, I think that the idea of advanced technological civilizations that were ruled by and started by entities that were not fully human is definitely coming. The disclosure of that is definitely coming in the near future. I think it's going to be associated with alien disclosure, and I think that whereas right now they're trying to hide and cover up the antediluvian civilizations all over the world, because as most people listening to the show are probably aware, these kind of megalithic structures and pyramids are on every continent all over the world, and many of the structures are constructed exactly the same, and all of this points back to a universal race or empire or civilization that once existed, and I believe it's all pointing back to an antediluvian civilization, and we're coming full circle. Historically, we're coming full circle. It's not that we started at B and we're ending at Z. We started at A and we're ending at Z. It's that we started at A and we're going all the way back around to A. In other words, even in the sense of the gospel, we started with the Garden of Eden and Adam sinning and falling and all of everything that's come of it. Jesus is the second Adam. He's restoring what he's redeeming us, and we're going to become again what we were made to be. So everything is going full circle. The biblical narrative, the historical narrative, it's all going full circle. And I think that's kind of something people need to think of the historical line more of a circle. It's going back to where it started. I think that's just the natural progression. That's God's plan, and so obviously we reference as in the days of Noah often, and a lot of people scoff at that and say, well, that's not what it means. It means that suddenly destruction will come. But for anybody who studies the Bible and studies it seriously and takes it seriously, will understand that there are, in many cases, both a metaphoric and literal point being addressed in the same phrase, in the same verse. And the Bible is multidimensional. And so, just as in the days of Noah, referencing that the destruction came swiftly, I believe it's also obviously referencing the conditions of earth in the days of Noah. So, to the point of the question, yes, I do believe that Atlantis specifically is going to come to the forefront. The legend of Atlantis, I think we are going to discover that Atlantis was in fact real, whether it's Sardinia or not. I do believe that it is going to be a factor. We are going to realize it was real, advanced technology, flying machines, anti-gravitical machines. I think it's all coming to the forefront. And hopefully that answers that question. But if
it does, and I want to go to. Yeah, hey, Tim, hold on. I want to read this because you brought it up. And when we talk about antediluvian, we're talking about before the flood. And Jeremiah 4 gives one of the most amazing views into the dateless past. And I'll just start right now by, verse 20, Jeremiah 4:20. Destruction upon destruction is cried, for the whole land is spoiled. Suddenly are my tents spoiled and my curtains in a moment. How long shall I see the standard and hear the sound of the trumpet? For my people is foolish. They have not known me. They're sought as children, and they have none understanding. They are wise to do evil, but to do good they have no knowledge. Now here's the change into a different time frame. I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void, and the heavens, and they had no light. Pastor Langford said that the Lord has been dealing with him on tohu and bohu. Those are two Hebrew words that basically appear in only two places in the Old Testament. This one and in Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and the earth was without form, and was void and without form, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. That's I beheld the mountains, and lo, and there was no man. This is not talking. There was no Adam, and all the birds of heaven were fled. I beheld, and lo, the fruitful place was a wilderness. Now listen to this. And all the cities thereof were broken down at the presence of the Lord, and by his fierce anger. For thus saith the Lord, or for thus hath the Lord said, the whole land shall be desolate, yet will I not make a full end. For this shall the earth mourn, and the heavens above shall be black, because I have spoken, I have purposed it, and will not repent, neither will I turn back from it. So I guess the interesting thing is, when you see tohu and bohu, you're talking, when God says replenish the earth, God creates something. Replenish means allow to come back that which has perished away, in this case under judgment. So one of the things that's interesting, ladies and gentlemen, is that the Bible specifically talks about two floods. So in turning that back over now to Tim, it's critical because, again, there's nothing that's hidden that won't be made known or won't be revealed. And we're talking about, I would say this, a timed, sealed revelation. If somebody can prove to me, like the emailer, that you knew this stuff 40 years ago and wrote about it, send it to me, and I'll read it on the air. So anyway, Tim, all I'm saying right now is this, is that we are seeing right now the return of the days of Noah. And I like what you said. You know, people say suddenly, of course, the same people that say, oh, that doesn't mean that are the ones that are waiting for an e-ticket out of here as, literally now I think I'm not keeping exact track, But if I do the numbers of the amount of Christians being slaughtered worldwide, hello, do you think maybe we could be at least approaching the Great Tribulation? And all you guys that keep saying, well, the Lord is coming on Rosh Hashanah this year. We've been saying that since 1988. Well, this year this is the Shemitah. Now, listen, Jesus prayed, and this is critical to understand, that we would be overcomers. Not that the Father would take us out of the world, but that he would keep us through the world. The evil is taken out of the world. The separation of sheep and the goats, the wheats and the tares. And why this is critical is, Doug, I'm serious, Tim, the appetite of the demons, the appetite of the giants, let me make this clear to people. The Catholic Church said to our interviewee that Tim talked to that basically, don't touch these giants, they're demons. They're not demons. The spirits of the giants become demons. But the point is, there is a if you will, a reassembling. And I believe one of the things that Sue Bradley, bless her heart, God bless her, I miss her with all my heart, so do a lot of you. But one of the things we discussed, could Ezekiel's army be, the very resurrection of the giants as the evil spirits which were bound and now are loosed come back to inhabit them? And Tom Horn, I think, and I address that casually, because, ladies and gentlemen, the thing is, the voice of God asks Ezekiel, can these bones live? Everybody, and then it talks about, and God raises up an exceeding great army. The book of Joel, the army of the Lord there is not a human army. So, Tim, we're talking about them bones, them old bones. We're talking about the giant bones. But we're also talking about something so more important, I'm going to give it right back to you, is the fact that we are getting ready to deal with Stargate. Do you want to, basically, we'll post a picture tomorrow on Doug's site showing in Greek that where Tim Alberino is standing, it says the giant's tomb, does it not?
Yeah, and it says it in Italian and Latin. There's a couple of places in Sardinia that one of the places, actually these two places actually are sanctioned touristic places, and ironically they're both called the Tomb of the Giant. And tradition holds that giants were buried there, and we filmed the tomb, and it's obvious that the tombs were made for 9 foot tall people, probably anywhere between 8 and 10 feet tall people at least. So, and they just say the tombs of the giants. It's in Italian and Latin, and so. But of course, the historians and the archaeologists in Sardinia, the traditional historians and archaeologists, will say, "Oh, that's just legend. That's just what it's been called." In the mythos, the Tomb of the Giant, so that's the name we put on there, but it really wasn't giants. Meanwhile, we're told that all these archaeologists in Sardinia, we were told multiple times that the archaeologists in Sardinia are millionaires because they take all of these incredible artifacts of giants and of advanced technology from the past, and they sell it on the black market. And I asked a couple of the guys, who do they sell it to? And basically, in a nutshell, the information I got back was the Illuminati. So, very interesting how everything correlates. And I'll get back into tying into why I think Sardinia could be Atlantis in a minute, because I think people are probably wondering where the connection is there. But let me, before I move on, I just want to touch on the scriptures that you were reading, Stephen, in the second chapter of Daniel, with the statue, the statue of that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream. Basically, Daniel's interpretation of that statue, not basically, literally, Daniel's interpretation of that statue, as Steve said, was that it represented the 5 kingdoms, the final, the feet of the statue being the final empire. Now, something that always vexed me in the past was this idea of the feet being iron mixed with clay. And just as I was referencing in the days of Noah text, where people say, oh, it only means that suddenly, and I'm saying no, it means suddenly, and it's a reference to what the days of Noah were like. Well, so in this situation, with the feet of this statue being iron mixed with clay, I believe it's referencing 2 things here. One of the things is plainly written. The other thing is veiled. The other thing is a little more concealed, and it takes a little bit of wisdom to pull it out. And if people don't think that God does that in the Bible, they're just not reading the Bible properly, because God does that all throughout Scripture. In fact, in the book of Revelations, we're told to calculate the number of the beast. And so there's obviously things that are there that God purposely conceals so that we can discover them and find them out. Anyway, there's a host of scriptures that prove that is in fact the case. But the point is that the iron mixed with clay analogy references in the feet of the statue, that in Daniel chapter 2, the feet of the statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream. The final empire, that's what those feet represent. The final empire that will rule on this planet before Jesus comes back and destroys, basically smashes it into smithereens and sets up his own kingdom. That final empire is represented in two feet that have 10 toes and that are iron mixed with clay. And what occurred to me was that obviously the analogy of the iron mixed with clay, the Bible tells us, that Daniel tells us, that it means that it's going to be that empire, the final empire, is going to be partly strong and partly broken. Everybody, most theologians and people who are interested in eschatology stop there, and they say, oh, that's the reference. That's what it means. It means it's going to be partly broken, and of course the feet naturally will have 10 toes. So some people extrapolate out that those 10 toes are 10 kingdoms, and so they say, okay, the feet, the iron mixed with clay, the kingdom will be divided, and the 10 toes of the feet, because it has 2 feet, represent a fragmented kingdom. Okay, done. File it away. We figured it out. But it never sat well with me, and it took studying Atlantis to look back at this verse and say, wait a minute, there's something here that everybody skips over, and it's this. Just as Steve read in Daniel 2:43-44, where it's talking about the iron mixed with clay, they, referring to the feet, referring to the final empire, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave to one another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. A lot of people stop there, but this is something that really doesn't pop off the page. It didn't for me until I studied Atlantis. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. Wait a minute. We have the they identified. Who are the they that shall mingle themselves with the seed of men? These kings. What kings? The kings that are represented in the 10 toes of the final empire. So I believe that Daniel is literally pointing to an Atlantean empire, 10 hybrid kings, literally hybrid kings that are going to rule over the final empire on this planet. Now, here is the scary thing about this. These 10 hybrid kings, when you read further into the chapter into the book of Revelations, they give their authority to one man. So, and I don't think he's fully human either, and I'm talking about the Antichrist. So picture these 10 hybrid kings that are hybrid kings, like the hybrid kings of Atlantis. Atlantis was the prefiguration of this final empire with its 10 giant hybrid kings, the final empire of the earth before Jesus comes back, being ruled by 10 hybrid kings who give their authority. And by the way, the Bible says that God entices them to give their authority to the beast, not the devil. That's an interesting thing. God entices them to give their authority to the beast. They give their authority to the beast, which is the authority over the whole earth, these 10 kings, because their empire is divided among them. 10 hybrid kings ruling the whole earth with a fragmented empire. They give their authority to the beast, but it doesn't stop there. The beast gets the authority of the 10 hybrid kings of the final empire. But also, the dragon gives the beast his authority. So that now it begins to really show us how much authority the Antichrist is actually going to have. It's really incredible. The 10 hybrid kings give him their authority. God entices them to give the beast their authority, to give the Antichrist their authority. And the dragon, who's separate from these 10 hybrid kings, gives the Antichrist, gives the beast his authority. Now, that's a lot of authority invested in one person. I just say that so that people can get a feeling for how much authority the Antichrist is going to wield at the end of the age, I believe it's going to be unprecedented. And by the way, again, as I said, I do not believe that the Antichrist will be fully human. I believe he also will be a hybrid. And I believe that most of the inhabitants of the planet, by the time this occurs, will not be fully human. I believe the genetic revolution is coming. It plays into this, that the 10 kings of the final empire are hybrids. They mingle themselves with the seeds of men, and that the mark of the beast has something to do with hybridization. And that's my opinion. But anyways, so the second meaning of the iron mixed with clay in the context of Nebuchadnezzar's prophetic statue, in my opinion, is that the 10 kings of the final world empire, as prefigured in the 10 kings of Atlantis, will be hybrids of some kind. Again, to summarize this, it is my opinion that Atlantis is an emblematic depiction of the antediluvian old world order and the prophetic harbinger of the coming new world order, which will reinstitute the golden age, when the gods mingled themselves with the seed of men and hybrids walked the earth. I believe that will define the final empire of this planet, the final empire of men of this planet, the final age before Jesus comes back and smashes it all into pieces and establishes his kingdom. So now, Sardinia. Now here's why my eyes started to open up in Sardinia, because I went into the details about these megalithic structures having the quartz on them, and the shining city, and the city that glowed that shone in the day from the reflection of the sun and glowed at night from the reflection of the moon. This is something very interesting. There's a lot of details about Atlantis that Doug referenced a couple of them that are specific to Atlantis that are on Plato's account. I don't have time to even go through the half of them, but there are some very specific things. For example, Plato talks about, or Solon talks about or I should say the priests of Sais who are talking to Solon, talk about Atlantis having three primary colors in the building of the structures. In other words, that the blocks, the material they say in the Critias, was black, white, and red. And it was made of a material called, the red material was a material that Plato calls orichalcum. And that's something that once I started to realize, hey, this might be Atlantis, I had my eyes open for orichalcum, because according to Plato, orichalcum does not rust. But interestingly enough, in Sardinia, there are three, and you can find this. This is common knowledge. Now, this is sanctioned knowledge about Sardinia. In other words, you can find this in the historical accounts that is part of historical orthodoxy of Sardinia, that they built. Their structures were built with stones of three colors: black, white, and red. So in the ancient times, if you were to come to the island of Sardinia, you would see a lot of these megalithic structures, and the colors of these structures were literally black, white, and red. Doug referenced the hot springs that basically the Critias says that Poseidon made rivers. He made a series of ringed waterways around the city of Atlantis that spiraled down from the city all the way to the sea, so that you could navigate from the sea all the way, or spiral all the way around these waterways to the primary city of Atlantis, to the pinnacle of Atlantis. And listen, this is incredible, because all over the place you can find, to this day, you can find that antediluvian concrete pillars with, in many places, you have these massive rings that were made out of iron, cast iron rings, massive cast iron rings, with connected to these rods that were literally cemented into the columns, and these massive rings were placed there to hold ships, and where these rings are still standing in Sardinia, there are no rivers. So that's evidence that there was once a massive system of rivers, because they're found all over Sardinia. And Legend of Sardinia says that the ancient Sardinians, which many believe were the Atlanteans, had a massive fleet of 1,300 ships, and that these ships could power themselves, could move without oars and without sails. So again, we're talking about a reference to advanced technology and evidence of, literal evidence that is still standing there to this day, of an ancient waterway that wrapped literally wrapped around the island down to the sea. It spiraled all the way around the island. In fact, one of the guys told us that the name, because I started to put it together when I started to see this massive pyramid from the distance that's on Doug's website. That's a picture that we took. I saw a waterway, a massive what was obviously once a waterway. It was a very smooth waterway, but it was massive, and it didn't have water in it anymore. And I looked at the guide that was with us, and I said, "Is this an ancient waterway?" He said, "Yes." He said, "This was part of the waterways that was once identified as the ringed rivers, because it made rings around the island of Atlantis so that you could sail up from the sea all the way to what they now call the Lost City, where the Great Pyramid is. And over where that pyramid is, there are massive geometric structures." And when I say symmetrical geometric structures that are absolutely massive in scope, that if you look at them, you think at first you're looking at hills, but the closer you look, you realize, hey, this could have been, because it's geologically symmetrical, the way that it looks like a temple or something. And I was standing next to Darren, my friend who accompanied me, and we were both just marveling at this, saying, this looks like symmetry here. This is geometry. This is not a product of nature. And it was right across from this massive pyramid sitting in this valley. And, of course, the pyramid, as you can see on Doug's site, has trees planted in rows to cover up the fact that it's a pyramid. And the structure that you see on top of that pyramid is the remains of a castle that was built in the late 11th century. So in the medieval times, they built a castle on top of this, probably just because it was an efficacious place to build a castle. It suited them in terms of the defense of that structure. They didn't build the pyramid. That pyramid, by the way, from my estimation, looks to be at least as big as some of those pyramids in Egypt, if not as big as the biggest one or even bigger. I don't know. We're actually trying to get the measurements of it right now. But it is a massive pyramid, and not in the picture that Doug has, but in the video that's coming out in the future from Gen 6 Productions, you're going to be able to see the scale of this pyramid, because there's a house at the bottom of it, and that gives you an idea that this thing is many stories high, a massive construction that is obviously trying to do a very pitiful job of covering it up with trees planted around it, just like the pyramids that Steve referenced that are found in China and all over the earth, these pyramids. And so basically we have the legend of these ringed waterways, the ringed water system that spiraled around the island down to the sea. And we have evidence of this because, like I said, all over the island are these cast iron rings that are cemented with this antediluvian cement into these posts where ships used to dock. And when I say cast iron rings, I hold up one of these rings in the video. This thing weighs somewhere around 45 pounds, 50 pounds. And it's cast iron. This thing these things were not made to hold fishing boats, on the bank of the river. These things were made to hold ships. So there were ships docked all over the island of Sardinia. Again, there's hot and cold water springs all over this island. Red, black, and red stones, the stones that were used to construct the edifices were in many cases tinted red, black, and white, just like the account of Plato. I'm trying to think of all the other things that match up here. There's a bunch of them. It's not just a couple. I tried to start to list them earlier, and I forgot what they were, but there's a handful of different things.
Yeah, if I can interject a couple of things here. You mentioned about the colors, and I found it interesting in the after I talked to Steve, and he was telling me about the connection between Sardinia and Atlantis. Of course, just to expand briefly on the colors, the red and black come from the coral, which is indigenous to Sardinia, and I thought that was extremely interesting. But the other part too. The Sardinia is noted to have numerous types of forestation or wood, if you will, and Plato talks about this, or was given to Plato, and Plato talks about the island had this abundance of various types of woods, and it was heavily forested before the systematic clearing of the island by the So all of this is really, it's lining up, man. It really blew my mind when Steve was talking about this, because this was the furthest thing from my mind. So yeah, you've got just a targeted bullet list of things that seem to be lining up right with Plato's.
That's right.
Go ahead. Didn't mean to take you off track there, but there's so many things.
About there's a lot of things, and it talks about Plato references let me see if I can pronounce this right, the Pillars of Hercules, which was, most people assume that it was the Straits of, how do you say that, Gibraltar, I think is the way that's pronounced. Yeah, which is basically over there by Spain, connecting Spain and Africa there. But there's actually, when I got back from Sardinia, Steve and I sat down, and we were just looking at all the similarities between the legend and the ruins and the artifacts that are in Sardinia and the legend of Atlantis. And we did some research, and we found out we're not the only ones that think that Sardinia, it might have been Atlantis. So we're not trying to say, hey, we're the ones who came up with this. No, in fact, there's an Italian journalist whose name is Sergio Frau. I think that's how you pronounce his name. It's Sergio, and then his last name is Frau, who's drawn international acclaim and also fueled heated criticism, because he wrote a book that really gave a strong case, that put forth a strong case that Sardinia was in fact the location of Atlantis, and that the Pillars of Hercules were not in Gibraltar, but instead were in the Straits of Sicily. So
the Straits of Messina.
The Straits of Messina or the Straits of Sicily, either one of those,
right?
Because the Straits of Messina is the one between Sicily and the mainland Italy, and then the Straits of Sicily is between Sicily and what used to be Carthage, or the African continent, which some people say that before the ocean expanded was a lot closer together than what it is today. But anyways, his book and his assertion that Sardinia was Atlantis was so strong that the United Nations Cultural Heritage Body, UNESCO, organized a symposium, I think in 2008 or 2009, on the issue of Sardinia being Atlantis in Paris, suggesting the idea was worth serious consideration. And I'm reading from an article: academics, archaeologists, geologists, and historians from across Italy met in Rome to take a closer look at the theory and the possibilities of its feasibility. So this is not something that we're just pulling out of our heads. This is, and again, we weren't going there to look for evidence of Atlantis. We were going there to look for evidence of giants, which I believe we found and documented. But it just so happens, after I did my analysis, which featured the Atlantis mythos and the Plato's Critias and all those details, that here I am standing in Sardinia. What these older villagers are telling me, hey, this is Atlantis. This is our history. This is what our history says. And, the 10 kings and the spiraling waterways that go down to the sea, and the black, red, and white edifices, and the fact that the pyramids, the massive structures were plastered with quartz. And also, for those who want to take a look at Sardinius on Google Earth, take a look at if you look in Google Earth at Sardinius, you'll see that it appears that Sardinius, that a third of it at least is submerged. I would say probably half of it is submerged. If you look on the map, it appears that a third to a half of Sardinius is submerged, and Sardinius used to be more in the shape of a oval than a rectangle as it is today. So much of Sardinia is under the water, and that's a fact. We talked to a guy who said that he used to dive for artifacts on the coasts of Sardinia, and he said, you wouldn't believe what's under the ocean. He said there's cities, entire cities under the ocean on the coast of Sardinia. And so all these pieces were adding up. And so here we are in Sardinia. I'm looking around thinking, my God, was this Atlantis? If it wasn't Atlantis, let me say this. If Sardinia isn't Atlantis, I think you can probably make the best case out of anything that's above that's not at the bottom of the sea, that Sardinia is the best candidate for Atlantis. Let's just say that. I'm not sure if Sardinia was Atlantis, but I believe that Sardinia is the best case to be made for Atlantis in terms of what we know about and what's above water. So now let me say this, because this is really tantalizing to me in terms of the analysis I did dealing with Atlantis, the exiles of Atlantis. I was, once I started to realize, hey, this could be Atlantis, and the Atlantis myth is here, and all these pieces are connecting, I started to get really interested in some of the other stuff that some of the people were telling us about that we were kind of shelving because we were most interested, obviously, in the bones of giants. I mean, we wanted to see bones. And they were telling us all this stuff about Atlantis, and they were telling us about all this supernatural phenomena that occurs in Sardinia that nobody really knows about. And I shouldn't say nobody, because a lot of New Age people know about it, and they flock to this certain person's house in Sardinia to see some very interesting phenomena occur. And one of the things that we were told happens is that there are these objects that come in that come in the sky at nighttime. They call them walking stars. We were pretty skeptical. We thought and still think that some of what they're describing is probably satellites, but some of it, obviously, if they're telling us the truth, is not satellites, because they describe these orbs of light that come down from the sky sometimes. Sometimes they just move across the sky, but sometimes they come down from the sky. They hover over certain areas of the lost city, over towards the lost city and over towards some of the megalithic ruins, and they shoot beams down to the ground. And we have testimonies on camera who have testified that they have seen entities, humanoid entities, beaming down to the ground. And of course, we take all of this with a grain of salt. But once you start to think, hey, this could be Atlantis, there could be something still active here. Definitely, this would be an area that the occult would be very interested in. And we know for a fact, and we document it on our documentary, that there is an underground city underneath Sardinia, because the government has sealed off all the entrances that once gave access to the underground tunnels and to the underground cities. And we have multiple eyewitnesses who have been in the tunnels and have walked under the ground under some of these pyramids and stuff, and have testified on camera that they saw archways and structures and architecture under the ground, and that these weren't just primitive caves. These were artificial passageways that were connecting underground cities. And that's just like pyramids that are found all over the earth. The idea of underground cities and passageways is also ubiquitous all over the earth, especially where you find megalithic ruins. And so this person was telling us that he believes, this eyewitness who saw these orbs of light beaming these entities down into these specific locations, he said, and he just frankly told us, because I asked him, well, what do you think that is? He said, I believe that that the underground city is still active, and that the entities that used to be there are beaming up and down from the city. And of course, people will scoff at that, and they'll laugh and you know, at the notion that such technology could have existed in the past and maybe exists still today. But I believe that some of the entities that were, some of the Atlanteans were able to escape the flood. I believe they did it by means of stargates and by means of technologies that some of the black ops and some of the black budget projects, even of our own country, are meddling with even today. Steve, I'm sure you got a couple of things you probably want to say about that.
Well, we're at the time period now where, again, Tim, I've said, and I've been told this by so many people in the world of black ops and everything, it's not what's on top of the ground that's important, it's what's underneath. The Native Americans in the United States had vast underground tunnels, and that's how the Apaches, in many cases, were able to escape the U.S. cavalry, because bottom line is they knew about these things. But I think what's happening right now, and Doug, thank you for putting that up on your website, the Chinese pyramids. I want people to understand this. That, again, this is what I've got to get through tonight. Just as you've heard some amazing stuff, you've got to understand, I have to understand, we have to understand, we're no longer looking forward in the future at tribulation. It's here. You can't tell someone who's living in Africa that professes Jesus and knows that any day they could be slaughtered, beheaded, have their throats cut, or worse, and there are worse things that they're doing, or that, beholding, that we're not there yet. I think it's the most smug, egotistical, self-centered, arrogant, narcissistic denial of faith to somehow say, well, those people deserve it, but we don't. What's critical now, everyone, is this. God wants to give us understanding. Understanding is something that is just not present nowadays. And and I can tell, Doug, it's a safe statement to say that there's a whole lot of people listening to this. When God goes after his own, even the lost sheep, the black sheep, I've been a lost sheep, I've been a black sheep, and I just been basically, and I don't say this to take on anybody, but I know what it's like as a Christian to hold what God reveals to you as your truth, and they treat you like, not only should you be in the back of the bus, and I'm not picking on anybody's race on that, but they want to, put roller skates on you and a rope at the back of the bus and drive you, 100 miles an hour until basically you're just turned to pavement. That's how much people resist the word of the Lord. So, Tim, let's just deal with the Stargate phenomenon too, because obviously, and don't give out any details on we learned, ladies and gentlemen. By the way, I want everybody to know this. If you don't think they listen to us, they being the very powers of darkness, the powers of hell, I don't know, Doug, did you mention to everybody what happened to Jeremiah yesterday or the other day when they tried to leave? Well, they did go to Iraq. Did you share that on your radio show? Well,
in fact,
just to make it clear, thank you. Just to make it clear, if our own government won't allow these men and women, and Amanda, his wife is there, his little boy is there, I think he said there's about 10 of them, and they won't allow medical supplies and other things to go through, and they interrogated. Did you tell them this too? They were interrogated for 6 hours, and the powers that be tried to talk them out of going. Now remember, okay, in every way, shape, and form, the truth must be hidden, the truth must be veiled, the truth must be vilified, the truth must be assaulted, because the truth stands in direct reflection against all the lies that the enemy has sold the people who are his followers. Does that make sense? So we are absolutely now in a time of what I would say reflection. And the reflection, unfortunately, the world is settling for the image of the fallen one, the image of the cherub. By the way, Satan was, according to Ezekiel 28, Ezekiel 28, he was the anointed cherub in the garden. He actually led the worship of God. When and Nathan Leal's done a marvelous job on the Super Bowl imagery, as well as some of the other guys, I think, Front Page and other. But the point that people have got to understand is, ladies and gentlemen, the music industry, not all, but I would say it's safe to say this, 90% have embraced the Pied Piper of perdition. How do you get people like Katy Perry openly admitting she's a Satanist? When she said she prayed, it wasn't to God. And look, the thing is that we're dealing now with, I would say this, real amazing stuff. And it might be interesting for a lot of people, Tim, we'll take them, but not give away the boat right now or the farm, that, the people that know about Stargates, that use them, told me one time, I said, how are they activated? They said they're activated through sound, through words, and an energy source. They did not tell me what the energy source was, okay? I don't know that. Obviously, Tim and I are, believing God's going to show us that. Needless to say, my wife is not excited to go with me through a gate. The point is that a general who uses them in Spec Ops, I don't know if he's listening, but he said that it's I don't want to say the word, but the darndest thing that when you go through these, even if you're wounded, it has a supernatural effect on your body. Well, of course, I can't say this for sure, but I'm convinced that all of the sound waves that are being blasted at us every day, the television, the sucking our minds out through our eyes and ears, by all the infrasonics and everything else going on. I believe that what we're going to be investigating on the trip to South America is probably some of the most amazing stuff. Marcus Samuel was in my office, I don't know, a couple of months ago, and he, Tim, you met with him too, but he told the story about on the reservation watching the orbs come through literally out of a mountain that opened up, right, or out of the top of the mountain that opened up.
Yeah, out of a rock formation that actually forms. He actually described a rock formation there that is in that forms an opening like a circle. And he was actually listening to you on the air and talking with Greg Everson, I think, and that he actually saw it open and orbs come out of it. And Marcus has a really interesting story, and there's a lot of details involved in it, but it's very amazing.
Well, and Doug, I want to share this. And I would call them some Native Americans showed up at my office from one of the reservations. I don't want to expose them to any undue harassment, but excuse me. But one of the things that was really interesting to them is just in the about 15 minutes in my store, they came from another state. Bottom line is they were talking about all the bones that their ancestors had and all of the events that they see taking place. If I would say this, and I can't speak for other countries, we will be speaking about it to other countries, but I would say this, based on what Tom Horn shared with me a week ago on the phone and what he emailed me and what he and Chris Putnam are working on independent of us but parallel to us, and this is what's astonishing to me. The same thing that Brother Marcus is sharing, that others are sharing, the gates are literally opening. And even the Native American elders are astonished at what they see because, again, they understand that they have to seal these things up in what I think Tom called the sipapus. And the thing is that, in essence, doorways and portals to hell, and they go through a big ritual, but there are people coming in to those different areas, and guess who again? U.S. government, and there's so much attempt to open these things up. And CERN, here's the neat thing about CERN. Use an anagram. It's time to discern the true meaning of that. It is absolutely phenomenal to me that, when you look at the connection between heaven and earth, the connection between things coming up on the surface of the earth and coming down from heaven, what Tim is going to do. Tim, just address the whole Stargate thing real quick, because I think, and I'll be quiet. I think you got about 8 minutes, but do that so that people can understand that we talk about fleeing Atlantis before it's destroyed and fallen angels going off planet. I mean, when you understand stargates and advanced propulsion systems like the Vimanas, of which the ancient Sanskrit writings of India refer to, it's not hard to see how some of these guys escaped, is it?
No, and it's interesting to find that in some of the legends all around the earth, you actually have what appears to be a stargate opening up and entities coming out of the stargate purportedly to be from a land that was destroyed in the flood, bringing with them some of their high technology and basically establishing civilization. So I think that because of these legends and because of some of the evidence, we're actually going to, I won't say where exactly, but we're going to go, we're doing another expedition and we're going to put some of this on film, that there's people who still see these kind of things happening, or at least have seen in their lifetime, eyewitnesses that have seen some of this stuff open up and entities coming in and going through them, coming out of and going into some of this stuff. And so basically, because we have these legends, just like the universal flood legend, just like the universal legend of these great civilizations that were destroyed, and the giants and the mingling with the seed of men, the gods coming down and mingling with the seed of men, you also find intermingled among these legends, you find what appear to be stargates, and again, entities coming through them, bringing technology, bringing civilization, and in a particular case, which I referenced in the part 2 of the Plume Serpent series of the El Bruno analysis, a very specific personage, very specific legend concerning a guy named Amaru Muru, who came through a stargate, bringing a solar disk, either some people say from the legendary land of Muria, or from Atlantis. And he brought them not only did he bring some of the technology from this land that he escaped from before it was destroyed by a flood, but he also brought the religion, the system of religion, which basically is Luciferianism and the worship of the gods and the fallen angels. And so there's definitely a connection, and Steve and I are endeavoring to make some documentaries that help people understand these connections and put the pieces together. And I find it amazing that, that all of this stuff, I mean, come on, we've got pyramids and megalithic structures that appear to be built in the same way all over the planet. We've got flood mythos, we've got giants, we've got the intermingling of the gods with men. We've got all these stories of flying craft technology. By the way, it was said that the Atlanteans had flying craft, that they had the secrets of anti-gravitical propulsion or flying craft that don't use propellers, and something that akin to the ancient Sanskrit vimanas. And so you have all these accounts from all over the earth talking about all the same stuff, referencing the same stuff. Now, why don't they all have the exact same account? Well, the answer to that is quite simple. The answer to that is the Tower of Babel. That's why God diffused all these people groups. And, we know that when the people were diffused from the Tower of Babel, we know that even just the name of Nimrod suddenly, had 10 different, or probably a lot more different interpretations or different dialects. So, obviously, everybody knows the same thing at the Tower of Babel. Suddenly, they're dispersed all over the earth. God disperses them all over the earth. They don't speak the same language anymore. They're now distant from one another. And so what happens is you have these different mythos evolving from the same event. It's not difficult to understand. People say, well, why aren't they all the same if they're all talking about the same thing? That's why. And don't forget that the devil's not in the business of telling the truth. Fallen angels aren't in the business of telling the truth. So most of these stories, most of these myths have as a purpose behind them the distribution, the dissemination of these myths to lead people astray, to keep people from the gospel, to cause people to reject the gospel. That's why everything kind of fits together, but it also has different details that don't make sense, when you put them together, when you put this mythos together with that mythos from two different parts of the earth. It's because there's deception involved, and it's because Babel, God purposely separated everybody at the Tower of Babel. So any of the mythos, or I should say the history from the antediluvian world before the flood of Noah, was a universal history, universally known to everybody before the Tower of Babel. And I think that's important for people to understand. That's why, again, when people go to the four corners of the earth after Babel, they all have pieces and parts of the same story. But the important thing to understand is that you can't understand any of this unless you read the Bible and believe it, because the Bible is the cornerstone. You can't build any kind of – people try and build all these wacky ideas and all these ridiculous notions about all these Atlantis and the flood was only localized to one area and all this stuff, because they get away from the biblical narrative. But if you stay on the biblical narrative, if you stay within the context of Scripture, and then you allow for other things to add to confirm the things that are said in Scripture, then you start to build this picture, and it starts to make sense that, hey, they had advanced technology. They were able to travel from place to place instantaneously through stargates. They were able to fly through the heavens in anti-gravitical machines, vimanas. You start to put all these pieces together, and then suddenly you realize why the Vatican and why the historical orthodoxy rejects the truth, because it absolutely blows everything we've ever been taught out of the water. And at the end of the day, it confirms the text of Scripture.
Suppression of history, misdirection, misapplication. The Bible, of course, is the ultimate source of all legitimate information. Mr. Alberino, thank you so very much. Steve, thank you so much. We're at the close of our program. Steve, you got about 30 seconds if you want to close it out, sir.
Well, God bless everyone. Thank you for tuning in again. this stuff, I think what Tim just spelled out is the absolute imperative. Everything I have learned, Doug, I've said this so many times, but I want to reconfirm it. Outside of the Lord Jesus Christ, His mercy and His opening up my eyes, every single thing that I have ever investigated was based on the book of Genesis, either Genesis 1:1 or Genesis 6:4, and look at what the grace of God has done. And now Tim just laid it out in such a clear manner. You cannot understand this stuff. The Bible's a love letter from the heart of God to the heart of His people. Turn your hearts to Jesus, ladies and gentlemen, because in these days and hours, the last closing minutes of history, not the end of the world, Jesus is the only one that can see any of us through, carry us through, and take us through. Doug, good night. God bless you. Thanks, Tim. We'll talk again.
Good night, gentlemen.
Good night.
And that'll do it. That'll do it for us tonight. Until tomorrow, God bless and stay safe.